Section 1. The Family Behind the Chaos. There is something strange about a show that has been running for over 25 years on a major television network, has produced more than 400 episodes, has been canceled twice and come back from the dead each time, and is still somehow misunderstood by a large portion of the people who watch it. Family Guy is one of the most watched animated programs in the history of American television. Almost everyone alive in the Western world knows who Peter Griffin is. Most people could hum the theme song in their sleep without even realizing they are doing it. Millions of people have seen clips of the show without ever watching a full episode. It has been shared, screenshotted, memed, quoted, and dissected on every corner of the internet. But ask most people what Family Guy is actually about, and the answers you get are usually surface level. It is about a dumb dad who does stupid things. It is about random cutaway jokes. It is that show that makes offensive humor. It is the animated comedy that got weird somewhere along the way, and everyone argues about when exactly it started going downhill. Very rarely do you hear anyone talk about what the show was doing underneath all of that noise, what it was really about when it was at its best, what its characters actually represented, what the family at the center of everything was genuinely trying to say about American life, about suburban existence, about the strange gap between who we want to be and who we actually are. What it meant that this show, with all its darkness and its absurdity, and its willingness to go to places most television would not touch, also had genuine warmth buried inside it. Warmth that was easy to miss if you were not paying attention, but unmistakably there. That is what this is going to be about. We are going to go slow tonight. There is no rush here. Think of this less as an analysis and more as a quiet, unhurried walk through everything that made this show special in the first place. Through the characters. Through the episodes that defined them, through the world Seth MacFarlane built in that fictional corner of Rhode Island, and through what the whole thing was really saying once you look past the chicken fights and the Conway Twitty songs and the cutaways about random celebrities doing absurd things. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want to. Let the words wash over you, because there is genuinely a lot here that is worth thinking about, and most of it has never been said as plainly as it deserves to be said. Let us start at the very beginning. Before there was Family Guy, there was a young man at the Rhode Island School of Design named Seth MacFarlane. He was born in Kent, Connecticut on the 26th of October, 1973. He was the kind of kid who was drawing cartoons almost before he could hold a pencil properly, and by the time he was in college studying animation, he had already figured out that the kinds of stories he wanted to tell were specific ones. They were stories about families, about the gap between the polished image of what a family is supposed to look like and the messy, loud, contradictory reality of what a family actually is. While still a student, MacFarlane made a short animated film as part of his thesis work. He called it The Life of Larry. It featured a middle-aged, somewhat heavy-set man with simple pleasures, a tendency toward poor decision-making, and a talking dog. The dog's name was Steve. The man's name was Larry. If you have ever seen even a single episode of Family Guy, you already know exactly who those two characters eventually became. After MacFarlane graduated, he went to work at Hanna-Barbera, the storied animation studio responsible for an enormous range of classic American cartoons. He worked on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. All while he was doing that work, he was quietly developing what would eventually become the pitch that changed his life. He expanded the characters from his student short, built a whole family around them, gave them names, gave them a setting, gave them a neighborhood full of people who would become just as important to the show's identity as the Griffins themselves. In May of 1998, MacFarlane sat down with executives at Fox and pitched a 15-minute pilot. He had created hand-animated materials to accompany the pitch. The executives Gary Newman and Dana Walden were impressed by what they saw and heard, and they commissioned the show. MacFarlane was 24 years old when this happened. He became one of the youngest showrunners in the history of American network television. The show premiered on the 31st of January 1999. It aired immediately after Super Bowl 33, which was one of the most prestigious time slots in all of broadcasting. Millions of people who had just finished watching the game stayed on their couches and saw the first episode of Family Guy. Around 22 million viewers watched that night. For a brand new animated sitcom, it was an enormous debut. The setting MacFarlane chose was deliberate and carefully considered. The Griffin family lived in a fictional town called Quahog in Rhode Island. This was not an accident. McFarlane was himself from the New England area. He grew up in Connecticut and studied in Rhode Island, and using that region as the backdrop gave the show a very specific geographic and cultural flavor. Rhode Island is a small state. Quahog is a fictional creation, but it has the texture of a real New England working-class suburb. It has the kind of feel where everybody vaguely knows everybody, where the local bar has been there for 40 years, where nobody is especially wealthy, but nobody is quite desperate either. The Griffins lived in a yellow house on Spooner Street, 2 stories, blue roof, a garage, red front door. The interior was specific and lived in the way that animated homes often are not. There was a couch and a television in the main room, pictures on the walls, a kitchen that felt like a real kitchen. This was a family that existed in a specific place, in a specific house, with a specific set of routines and rhythms. Now let us meet the family properly, because understanding who these people were at the start before the show changed, before anything went sideways, before the years started accumulating and the decisions started piling up, is the key to understanding everything else. Peter Justin Lowenbroy Griffin, husband, father, brewery worker, devoted patron of the Drunken Clam, large man, reddish-brown hair, white dress shirt, green pants. His voice was based on a security guard McFarlane had overheard during his time at RISD. Something about the cadence and the sound of it stuck with the creator, and he used it as the foundation for the man who would become one of the most recognizable characters in animation history. Peter was Irish Catholic. He was a working-class man in every sense of that phrase. He valued simple pleasures. He had strong opinions about things he did not fully understand. He was intensely loyal to his friends, and he genuinely, deeply loved his family even when his actions suggested otherwise. He started the show working at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, later losing that job and eventually finding steady employment at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He was not educated beyond what was absolutely necessary. He was not worldly. He did not read books or attend the theater or have much patience for the kind of culture that Lois occasionally tried to bring into the household. But here is the thing that most discussions of Peter Griffin miss entirely. In those first 3 seasons, Peter was not just stupid. Stupid is too simple a word, and it implies a kind of emptiness that the character simply did not have. Peter was genuinely limited in certain ways. His intelligence was not his strong suit. His impulse control left a great deal to be desired, and his grasp of consequences was shaky at best. But he had emotional intelligence in ways that went largely unacknowledged. He could read a room when it mattered. He knew when he had gone too far, even if it took him longer than most people to get there. He apologized. He circled back. He showed up. In the early seasons, episode after episode would end with Peter realizing he had made a mess of something and making a genuine effort to put it right. Not always successfully, not always gracefully, but genuinely. There was a warmth at the core of the man that made him more than a cartoon buffoon. He was a lovable idiot in the truest sense of that phrase. Someone whose heart was good even when his brain was unreliable. Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin, wife, mother, piano teacher, daughter of one of the wealthiest families in New England. Red hair, sharp eyes. Alex Borstein provided her voice, basing it on a cousin from Long Island, and somehow managed to make it both recognizable as a classic sitcom wife and completely her own. Lois's backstory was one of the quietly subversive things about the early show. She came from enormous wealth. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, was old money, blue blood New England, the kind of man who had strong opinions about everyone he considered beneath him and who made no secret of his contempt for his daughter's husband. And yet Lois chose Peter. She met him when he was working as a towel boy for her aunt, and she fell in love with his easy silliness, his warmth, his complete lack of pretension. She walked away from a life of comfort and expectation to build something smaller and louder and messier, and she did it because she wanted to. This is a character with a black belt in Taijutsu, a piano teacher who genuinely loves music, a woman who once held an undefeated record as a professional boxer, who worked briefly as a flight attendant, who was intelligent and capable, and far more interesting than the label of stay-at-home mom would suggest. Her role in the early show was the role of the person who holds the center. She was not a pushover. She was not simply patient. She was the eye of the hurricane, the still point around which all the chaos revolved, and she held that position with grace and occasional exhaustion. Brian Hound Griffin, The family dog, White Lab, walks on two legs, drives a Toyota Prius with the license plate BRI dog, drinks martinis, has been working on a novel for longer than he can honestly remember, voiced by McFarlane himself, in his own natural speaking voice, which is one of those facts that makes perfect sense once you know it and impossible to unknow. Brian was the character who most directly represented McFarlane's own sensibilities. The liberal politics, the atheism, the love of music, the cocktail in hand, the pretensions toward literary achievement, all of it was personal. Brian was smart in the way that someone who reads a lot and thinks carefully is smart. He was the grounded one, the one who could look at whatever disaster Peter had just set in motion and say something dry and perfectly accurate about it. He was the voice of reason, not because he had no flaws, but because he could see clearly what everyone else was too chaotic or too dumb to notice. He was also lonely. This is something that gets overlooked. Brian Griffin in those early seasons was a genuinely lonely character. He loved the family he lived with, but he existed slightly apart from all of them. He was not quite a pet and not quite a person. He had feelings for Lois that he mostly kept buried. He kept failing at writing. He kept falling for the wrong women. He kept drinking a little more than was probably a good idea. He was intelligent enough to see his own life clearly and not always happy about what he saw. This gave the character enormous depth. You could root for Brian because he was trying. Because underneath the sarcasm and the dry comments, there was someone who genuinely wanted things to work out, for himself and for the people around him, and who kept getting in his own way. Then there was Stewie, Stuart Gilligan Griffin, 1 year old, yellow shirt, red overalls, football-shaped head with a suspicious number of strands of carefully combed hair, British accent courtesy of McFarlane channeling Rex Harrison from My Fair Lady, inventor, schemer, self-proclaimed future ruler of the universe, and the singular most original character concept in the entire history of this show. The joke at the heart of Stewie Griffin was brilliantly simple and almost impossible to exhaust if you were creative enough with it. Here was a baby, 1 year old, a literal infant who was carried around in arms and placed in high chairs and had his diapers changed. Who should by all rights be making sounds like ba and da, and maybe experimenting with the word no? Instead, he spoke with the clipped precision of a Shakespearean villain. He had a laboratory hidden inside his room where he built laser cannons, mind control helmets, weather-altering machines, and devices of various kinds that would have been impressive coming from a team of MIT professors. His main long-term ambition was world domination. His main short-term ambition was to kill his mother, Lois, who kept unknowingly interfering with his plans for global conquest simply by being a parent. The brilliance of this concept was that it worked on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface level, it was just genuinely funny, this tiny diaper-wearing creature monologuing about enslaving humanity, while the adults around him cooed and tickled him and called him adorable, completely oblivious to what he was actually saying. The contrast between his appearance and his interior life was inexhaustible as a source of comedy. But there was a deeper level too. Stewie, for all his megalomania, was also a commentary on the interior life of small children that adults never get to see. Any parent who has ever looked at their baby and wondered what on earth is going on in there will find something resonant in a character who happens to be plotting world conquest. Babies are strange, opaque creatures who communicate almost nothing about their inner experience. The idea that one of them might be an evil genius is absurd enough to be hilarious, but also weirdly relatable in a way that sneaks up on you. Meg Griffin, oldest of the 3 Griffin children, teenager, attends James Woods Regional High School. In the first season, voiced by Lacey Chabert. Starting from season 2, voiced by Mila Kunis, who has held the role ever since. Unpopular, somewhat awkward, trying very hard to fit in and rarely succeeding. Meg in the early seasons was doing something very specific, and it was something that the show handled with more delicacy than it is usually given credit for. She was the ordinary character, in a family containing a father who was a lovable disaster, a mother with a secret history of professional boxing, a dog who drove a car and drank cocktails, and a baby who was constructing death rays in his crib. Meg was just a teenage girl who wanted friends, wanted boys to notice her, wanted to feel like she belonged somewhere. This was not a failure of imagination on the writer's part. It was the point. Meg was the mirror that made everyone else look extraordinary by comparison. But more than that, She was the character whose experience was the most universally recognizable for a large portion of the audience. The awkward teenager who wants to belong is one of the oldest and most reliable archetypes in storytelling, and she filled that role with genuine pathos in those early years. There were episodes where she was simply allowed to be a person, someone with a perspective and a desire and an emotional reality without the show making her into a target. Chris Griffin, the middle child, technically, given that Stewie exists but cannot count for these purposes. Chris was a heavy-set, somewhat baffled boy voiced by Seth Green with an improvised accent that drew loosely from the character Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. He was sweet in the way that a golden retriever is sweet, not especially alert, deeply good-natured, enthusiastic in an unfocused kind of way. He had a talent for drawing that occasionally surfaced in the background of plots. He was goofy and gentle and rarely at the center of things, which suited him fine. Together, this family formed the center of something that the show's theme song articulated directly and without irony. Lois starts singing the opening. It seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV. Then Peter comes in. But where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely? The theme song of Family Guy is a question. It is a legitimate question, asked by a family that represents everything the question is about. The Griffins are the answer to their own question. And the answer is uncomfortable. They are not a good example of good old-fashioned values. They are a loving, chaotic, imperfect, sometimes terrible attempt at what a family is supposed to look like. And the tension between the longing expressed in that opening song and the reality of the family it celebrates is the entire emotional engine of the show. MacFarlane has described the show as a modern vaudeville, a series of comedic snapshots and sketches strung together by the connective tissue of a family's daily life. He has cited All in the Family as a major influence, and that influence is visible everywhere once you know to look for it. The show that opens with two people singing at a piano, the husband who is in over his head and the wife who loves him anyway, the satirical skewering of working-class suburban American life, all of this traces directly back to Archie and Edith Bunker. But Family Guy pushed further than All in the Family ever did, in directions that would have been unthinkable on network television in the 1970s. It pushed into absurdism, into chaos, into the purely surreal, into territory where the rules of reality simply did not apply, and nobody was expected to pretend they did. This freedom, this willingness to go anywhere, to interrupt a story about Peter's job with a cutaway about something that happened in ancient Rome, to have a baby calmly explain the mechanics of a thermonuclear device before asking for his bottle, was the thing that made the show feel genuinely new when it arrived. At its core, though, the Griffin family was about something remarkably traditional. They were about whether love is enough to hold people together when everything else is a mess. About whether you can be a good parent when you are still figuring yourself out. About whether a marriage can work between two very different people who chose each other for reasons they can barely articulate. About whether a child who feels invisible in her own home can still grow up to be okay. These are not small questions. They are the questions that most sitcoms glance at and then flinch away from. Family Guy, in its best moments, looked directly at them. If you have made it this far and you are feeling comfortable and cozy wherever you are, drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing that people from all over the world are listening to these words at the same moment, even if they are half asleep doing it. And if you have not subscribed yet, you can do that now. It is free, it means a lot, and it helps this channel keep doing exactly this. Section 2, Peter Griffin, the man nobody took seriously enough. Let us settle in and take our time with Peter Griffin. Because Peter deserves more careful attention than he usually gets, and most of what people say about him gets the whole thing somewhat wrong. The conversation about Peter in critical spaces usually goes one of two directions. Either people talk about how he was a lovable fool in the early seasons and then became unbearable as the show went on, which is accurate as far as it goes but does not actually explain what made him lovable in the first place. Or people treat him as a simple punchline, the fat dumb dad, the cartoon slob, the most obvious version of a Homer Simpson type who never managed to be as interesting as the character he was supposedly borrowing from. Neither of these takes is deep enough to be useful. Peter Griffin in the first 3 seasons of Family Guy was doing something that sounds simple when you describe it, but is actually quite difficult to pull off. He was a working-class man who was treated with dignity by his own show. This is rarer than it should be. There is a long tradition in American situation comedy of treating working-class male characters as the butt of jokes. The fat guy, the guy who does not understand things, the guy who needs his more sensible wife to explain the world to him. This archetype goes back to Jackie Gleason and probably further. It is so deeply embedded in the grammar of the American family sitcom that it has started to feel like the only way to tell these stories. What MacFarlane did with Peter was more interesting. Yes, Peter was not smart. Yes, he did things that did not make sense. Yes, he often needed Lois to untangle the consequences of his decisions. But the show never suggested that Peter's limitations made him less than Lois, or less than Brian, or less than anyone else around him. He was not a figure of contempt. He was the center, the hero. In his own imperfect way, the show was named after him. Lucky there's a family guy. Lucky there's a man who positively can do all the things that make us laugh and cry. He's a family guy. Peter's character was built on a specific emotional truth that most people recognize when they encounter it, even if they have never articulated it. He was a man who had found a life that suited him, and who was genuinely happy in that life, even though it was not a glamorous life, and even though he was not living up to some idealized version of what a man or a father or a husband is supposed to be. He worked a factory job, then a brewery job. He drank with his friends at a bar called the Drunken Clam. He came home to a house that was somewhat chaotic, and a wife he genuinely loved, and 3 kids who needed varying degrees of management. He watched television. He had strong opinions about things he did not fully understand. He enjoyed simple pleasures with the full-throated enthusiasm of someone who had never been taught to feel embarrassed about his tastes. MacFarlane drew the voice from a real person, a security guard he heard talking while at the Rhode Island School of Design. The way he described it, there was something about the confidence of that voice, the way it moved through the world without apology, that seemed exactly right for Peter. The character Peter became was in some ways an extended meditation on a type of American man that television had always caricatured but rarely actually looked at: Irish Catholic background, working class. Devoted to his faith in the way that a lot of Irish Catholic working-class men were devoted to their faith, which is to say, not in a particularly deep or theologically sophisticated way, but in the bones. In the habit? In the automatic crossing yourself before a meal kind of way. His relationship with his father Francis was one of the quietly important emotional through lines of the early seasons. Francis Griffin was a hard man, cold in the way that men of his generation were often cold. Not cruel, exactly, but not warm either. He carried standards for his son that Peter could never quite meet, and the weight of that disappointment was something Peter carried without ever fully acknowledging it. He wanted his father's approval. He went to fairly elaborate lengths to try to get it. And there was something heartbreaking about watching a grown man who was, by most measures, actually doing fine at life, still straining for a word of recognition from someone who found it very hard to give. This is a story that millions of people recognize, not just men from Irish Catholic working-class backgrounds. Anybody who has ever wanted their parent to see them and felt like they kept falling slightly short will find something true in it. The show never made this storyline into its main event. It was always in the background, surfacing occasionally, reminding you that underneath the chaos and the jokes, there were real things happening to these people. Peter's friendships were another element that the early show handled with genuine care. Joe Swanson, Cleveland Brown, Glenn Quagmire. These were not just supporting characters who provided a change of scenery when the family storyline needed a break. They were Peter's actual friends in the way that real people have actual friends, people they had been drinking with for years, people they had seen through hard times, people they knew in the way you only know someone you have sat across from in a bar hundreds of times. Joe was introduced in the first season episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, as the cool new neighbor that the whole neighborhood admired. He was in a wheelchair. He was a police officer. He was tough and capable and genuinely impressive in ways that initially made Peter feel inadequate and jealous. But that jealousy evolved into respect and then into genuine friendship, the kind that did not require anyone to perform or to pretend. Peter and Joe could sit at the Drunken Clam and be completely honest with each other, even when the honesty was uncomfortable. Cleveland was steady and warm, a counterpoint to Peter's chaos. He had his own complications at home, his own marital difficulties, his own inner life that the show occasionally let us see. Quagmire was the wild card, the bachelor, the one without the domestic anchor, whose lifestyle the others observed with a combination of amusement and quiet envy that neither of them would have admitted to out loud. These four men sitting in a bar together was one of the most reliable sources of the show's emotional warmth in the early seasons. Not because their conversations were profound, not because they resolved great conflicts or achieved great things in those booths, but because the ease between them was real. You could feel that these were people who genuinely liked being around each other, Peter and Lois. This relationship deserves its own extended attention, and we will give it more later, but it is worth noting here that the core of the Peter-Lois dynamic in the early seasons was built on something specific and somewhat unusual for a sitcom of this kind. They genuinely, unambiguously loved each other. Not in a way that was constantly sweet or constantly functional. They fought, they had their silences. There were moments of real friction, but underneath all of it was a baseline of love and choice. She chose him, against her family's wishes, against the obvious logic of her situation. She chose this man because she saw something in him that her father could not see, and Peter, despite his constant failures and fumbles, held that choice as something sacred. He was faithful to her. He respected her. When things went wrong between them, he was the one who came back and tried to fix it. There is a moment in one of the early episodes that captures this perfectly. After a whole episode of mishaps and misunderstandings, Peter and Lois end up at the piano together in the living room. He cannot really play, and neither can she, but they sit there anyway, shoulder to shoulder. He looks at her, and there is something in that look that is not funny and not ironic and not a setup for a joke. It is just a man looking at his wife and being glad she is there. The early show was full of moments like that. Quick, unannounced, easy to miss if you were not paying attention. They were the emotional core that made the comedy land, because comedy without heart is just noise. And these writers understood that even if they did not always articulate it, Peter's arc across those first 3 seasons was not a grand dramatic journey. It was a series of small circles going out, making a mess, coming home, trying to make things right, over and over. In this respect, he resembled most of the people watching him. Most people's lives are not grand, dramatic journeys. They are small circles, out and back, mess and repair, try again. The working-class life that Peter embodied was one that a large portion of the audience recognized. Not everyone watching Family Guy was a middle-class college graduate. A lot of the people who made the show a hit in its first run were people who saw something of their own fathers, their own neighborhoods, their own bars and front porches in what was happening on screen. The exaggeration was there, but so was the recognition. Peter Griffin in his best form was a man who accepted himself, complicated as he was. He did not wish he were smarter or richer or more sophisticated. He was content. And in a culture that relentlessly tells people to be more and want more and achieve more, there was something almost radical about a main character who was basically fine with exactly what he had. This is what made him more than a cartoon. It is what made him a character. And it is what makes the later versions of Peter, stripped of this contentment, stripped of this warmth, reduced to something crueler and emptier, so fundamentally different from the person who stood at the center of the original show. For now, though, we are staying with the early version. The version who comes home from the drunken clam a little unsteady on his feet and still manages to tuck the kids in. The version who argues with Lois and then apologizes. The version who does something dumb and this is the key part, this is the thing that mattered, notices that he has done something dumb and tries to undo it. That last part was everything. The noticing, the trying. That is what separated early Peter from the empty vessel he would later become. And for 3 seasons, the show held onto it with both hands. Section 3. Lois Griffin, the most underrated character in animation. There is a reason people do not talk about Lois Griffin very much when they talk about what made Family Guy great. She is the stable one. She is the sane one. In a show built on chaos, she is the fixed point. And fixed points, by their nature, do not generate the same kind of excitement as everything that orbits around them. But fixed points matter. Without them, there is no orbit. There is just drift. Lois Pewter-Schmidt Griffin is one of the most carefully constructed characters in the history of animated television, and she has never received anything close to the recognition she deserves for it. Let us start with the backstory, because the backstory is where everything begins. Lois was born into money, real money. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, was not just comfortable, he was the kind of wealthy that does not discuss being wealthy, that considers the question of money to be settled long ago and not worth revisiting. The Pewterschmidts had expectations for their daughter. She would marry someone appropriate, she would live appropriately, she would maintain the dignity of the family name. She married Peter Griffin, a man her father openly despised and never stopped making clear that he despised. A man who worked in a factory, who drank beer at a working-class bar, who was nobody special by any conventional measure. And she did not just marry him as an act of rebellion. She genuinely loved him. She saw something in his laugh, in his ease with himself, in the complete absence of performance that defined him. He was exactly what he appeared to be. And to someone who had grown up surrounded by surfaces and presentations and the elaborate theater of old money, that kind of authenticity must have been astonishing. This decision, the choice to walk away from wealth and expectation in favor of something messier and more real, is the foundation of Lois's character. It tells you everything. It tells you that she values substance over appearance. It tells you that she has the kind of courage that does not announce itself. It tells you that she has a rebellious streak underneath the composed exterior, one that she has mostly domesticated but that surfaces at surprising moments. She became a mother. A stay-at-home mother mostly, though she taught piano on the side to supplement the family income, and over the course of the show she would take on other work when the situation called for it. Flight attendant, journalist, boxer briefly and undefeated, which is still one of the better character details in the show. Even mayor of the town for a stretch. Lois was educated, she was well-read, she had interests and passions that had nothing to do with her role as wife and mother, and the show was good about letting these surface without making them seem at odds with her domestic life. The piano was important. Music ran through her characterization in the early seasons as a genuine love, not a quirky trait to be trotted out for jokes. She taught children in the neighborhood. She played for her own enjoyment. The instrument was a link to a part of herself that the chaos of the Griffin household could not quite reach. She also had a past, a surprisingly rich one. She had been with other men before Peter. The show dropped hints and occasional explicit references to relationships with musicians, rock band members, someone from Whitesnake's road crew. Not in a way that was meant to define her or diminish her, but in a way that suggested she was a full person before she became Peter's wife and the kid's mother. She had a history. She had made choices, including some interesting ones. Her relationship with her father was another layer that the show developed carefully over time. Carter Pewterschmidt was cold and dismissive, and constantly contemptuous of Peter, but the dynamic between Carter and Lois was more complicated than simple resentment. She had wanted his approval and had stopped waiting for it. There was a kind of peace in her position, not resignation, but a genuine decision that she had chosen her life and she was not going to keep auditioning for permission to live it. What Lois did in every episode, in the smallest and most reliable way, was hold things together. She managed the household with one eye always on the horizon, watching for what Peter was about to break or misunderstand or accidentally ignite. She was not nagging when she redirected him. She was not lecturing when she explained why something was a bad idea. She was just doing the constant invisible labor of being the person in the house who sees the full picture, while everyone else sees their own particular corner of it. Alex Borstein, who voiced Lois from the very beginning, built the character's voice on a cousin from Long Island, and there is something in that vocal performance that makes Lois both specific and universal at once. She sounds like someone you know, someone's mom, someone's wife, someone who is managing a great deal more than is visible from the outside, and who does it without expecting credit for the managing. In 2018, Borstein won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Character Voiceover Performance for her work as Lois. This was entirely deserved. What she does with the voice is technically impressive, the range of emotion she can convey, the shifts between warmth and exasperation and dry humor and genuine tenderness, but more importantly, it is always grounded. Lois never sounds like a cartoon character who happens to have a clever line to deliver. She sounds like a person. The tension at the center of Lois's character was this. She was someone who had given up a particular kind of life in favor of this life. And she was fundamentally happy about that choice, but she was also honest enough with herself to know that there were days when the choice felt heavier than she had anticipated. She loved her children, but she had not necessarily planned all of them. She loved Peter, but she was not blind to who he was. She found genuine meaning in her domestic role, but she also had the intelligence and capability for something more formally ambitious, and that went largely untapped. The show occasionally let this tension breathe. There were episodes where Lois pursued something for herself, took a job, explored a skill, pursued something that had nothing to do with the family, and these episodes were often among the most interesting in the early seasons because they were willing to sit with the discomfort of a woman who has more inside her than her circumstances have found space for. She was also funny. This deserves to be stated directly because it is easy to lose in a discussion of her depth. Lois had a fantastic dry wit. She could deflate Peter's grandiosity with a single flat observation. She could turn a moment of genuine tension into something absurd with impeccable timing. Her humor was quieter than Peter's, less theatrical, but no less effective for that. Borstein herself has noted the complexity of the character, describing Lois as someone who is at once the voice of reason, the keeper of the family's emotional temperature, and a woman who has not entirely given up on the idea that her life might still surprise her. That is a rich set of qualities to hold simultaneously, and both the writers and the actor managed it. In the constellation of the Griffin family, Lois was the gravity, the force that kept everyone in orbit around the house on Spooner Street rather than spinning off into their various chaotic trajectories. Without her at the center, there was no show. There was just a man doing loud, stupid things in a house full of people who did not particularly like each other. She gave the family its heart, and she did it quietly, consistently, episode after episode, without ever needing to be the one the camera was focused on. Section 4. Brian Griffin, the failing writer who actually meant something. Brian Griffin is the character who provokes the most complex feelings from people who have been watching this show for a long time. There is something about him, something about what he was at his best and what he became at his worst, that gets under the skin in a way that the other characters do not quite manage. Start with what he was. Brian was a white Labrador retriever who walked on two legs, drove a car, spoke fluent English, held strong opinions about literature and politics, kept a martini perpetually within reach, and had been working on a novel for longer than he could honestly justify to himself. He was voiced by MacFarlane in his own natural speaking voice, no character accent, no performance layer on top, just MacFarlane talking as himself through the mouth of a dog. This was deliberate. Brian was the most autobiographical character on the show. The liberal politics were MacFarlane's politics. The atheism was MacFarlane's atheism. The love of jazz standards and big band music, the appreciation for classic Hollywood, the reflexive intellectualism, all of it was a direct pipeline from creator to character. Brian was Seth MacFarlane living inside the show, experiencing the chaos of the Griffin family from the most adjacent vantage point available. This gave the character an intimacy that the others did not quite have. When Peter did something outrageous, you were watching a creation. When Brian reacted to Peter doing something outrageous, you were watching a person. In the early seasons, Brian's role was the voice of reason. This is how he is usually described, and the description is accurate but slightly hollow. Being the voice of reason does not tell you what kind of person he was. It just tells you his function. What kind of person he was went deeper. He was gentle. This is the thing that surprises people who encounter the early Brian in rewatches. There was a gentleness to the character that later seasons completely abandoned. He noticed when people around him were struggling. He did not always fix things. His capabilities had limits, but he saw things. He paid attention in the way that intelligent, empathetic people pay attention. The way that makes the person on the other side of the conversation feel genuinely heard. His friendship with Peter was one of the show's great, unexpected achievements. On paper, there is no reason these two should work as friends. Brian is everything Peter is not: articulate, politically aware, culturally engaged, physically restrained. Peter is everything Brian would theoretically disdain: loud, impulsive, proudly ignorant in certain areas, content with simplicity. And yet the friendship between them was one of the most believably real things in the early show, because they did not need each other to be anything different. Brian did not need Peter to be smarter. Peter did not need Brian to be more like him. They had a long-running, comfortable, occasionally exasperated mutual affection that did not require justification. They just liked being around each other. And in the way that real friendships often work, the differences between them were not obstacles. They were part of what made the relationship worth having. Brian's writing. His endless, mostly unsuccessful writing. This was the most quietly poignant element of his characterization in the early seasons. He had a novel in progress. He had been working on it for years. He talked about it the way that people who are not sure they can actually do the thing talk about it, with an emphasis on the importance of the project, on the amount of time invested, on the eventual impact it would have, rather than on any specific details of what it actually contained. He kept it at arm's length from scrutiny because scrutiny might confirm what he suspected, that it was not very good and that he might not be as talented as he needed to be. This is an incredibly common human experience. The aspiration that outstrips the ability. The dream that you protect by never quite pursuing it fully. The thing you say you are working on so that the gap between who you are and who you might become stays open as a possibility rather than closing as a failure. McFarlane has acknowledged that Brian's writing career was inspired partly by Snoopy from Peanuts, another dog with literary ambitions who spent a great deal of time not actually writing. But where Snoopy's pretensions were mostly comedic, Brian's carried a genuine ache. You laughed at him, but you also recognized him. You had probably known someone like him. You might have been someone like him at some point. His love for Lois was handled in the early seasons with a delicacy that is easy to miss. He had feelings for her. This was established clearly but never made into something gross or threatening. He kept them mostly to himself. They surfaced occasionally in small ways, a look held slightly longer than it needed to be, a sentence that said one thing and meant something else. He knew the situation. He was not deluded about where those feelings could go. He just had them, the way people have feelings for friends' partners sometimes, and he managed them with a quiet dignity that made the whole thing touching rather than uncomfortable. He was also funny. His humor was different from Peter's quieter, drier, more dependent on exact word choice and perfect timing. The best Brian jokes were the ones where he said something that seemed flat until 2 seconds after you heard it, and then you were laughing at the exact moment when everyone else had moved on. The running gag of Brian at his most dog-like, occasionally eating something he found on the floor, or chasing a thrown stick before catching himself, was used sparingly in the early seasons, and it was brilliant for exactly that reason. These moments reminded you that underneath the martinis and the conversation about Hemingway, there was something instinctual that he could not fully suppress. It was not played for embarrassment. It was played as a gentle, recurring joke about the gap between who Brian presented himself as and what he actually was, and in this, it mirrored what the whole show was doing with the Griffin family in general. His relationship with Stewie in the early seasons was in its early stages, just beginning to develop into something significant. The show established that Brian could understand Stewie where most adults could not. He could hear the actual words, rather than the baby babbling that everyone else perceived. This made Brian the only real peer Stewie had, the only character in the house who engaged with him on his actual level. Their friendship began from this practical foundation and grew into something much richer over time, though the richest version of it would not arrive until the road to episodes started. The loneliness underneath everything was what gave Brian his resonance. He was intelligent, he was sophisticated, he was loved by the family he lived with, and yet he was slightly displaced from all of it. He did not quite belong in Peter and Lois's world. He was too different, too bookish, too politically aware. He did not belong in the world of his own ambitions. He could not quite get there. He had this house, this family, this life on Spooner Street, and it was good. It was genuinely good, but it was also a kind of stopping point rather than an arrival. He kept drinking. The martinis, the occasional extra drinks. Not to the point of crisis in the early seasons, there was not the dramatic alcoholism arc that later seasons would periodically gesture at, but with a consistency that suggested he was managing something. Something about the gap between his expectations for his own life and the life he was actually living. Something about getting older without reaching the things you had convinced yourself you would reach. Watching Brian in the early seasons, particularly in the quieter moments when the show slowed down enough to let the character just be a character, you saw someone who was doing what most thoughtful people do, trying to find meaning in the circumstances they have rather than in the ones they wished for. Not always successfully, not without cost, but genuinely trying. That is what made him the character who felt the most real. That is what made his later decline, when the writers stripped out this inner life and left only the pretensions, only the selfishness, only the hollow performance of the intellectual, so genuinely painful to watch for people who had been there from the beginning. For now, though, in the seasons we are spending time with, Brian Griffin was one of the best-written characters on American television. Quiet about it, not demanding your attention, but there, consistently, doing something truthful in the background of every scene he was in. Section 5: Stewie Griffin and what it means to put an evil genius in a diaper. Let us spend some real time with Stewie. He deserves it. If you ask most people to name the most original character concept in Family Guy, they will say Stewie without hesitation, and they will be right. But then if you ask them to explain why Stewie was original, what made the concept genuinely new rather than simply unusual, most of them will give you the surface answer. He's a baby who talks like a villain. He has a British accent. He builds weapons. He wants to kill his mom. These things are accurate, but they do not explain the depth of what the character was actually doing. To understand Stewie Griffin properly, you have to think about what babies represent in American culture and specifically in American family comedy. Babies are the endpoint of family formation. They are the proof that the family is real, that it continues, that the project of making a home and making a life has moved into its next phase. They are supposed to be innocent, blank, pre-moral, unformed. Television had played with the idea of babies having inner lives before Family Guy. Look Who's Talking from the late 1980s had done a version of this. And there had been other attempts, but almost all of them treated the inner life of a baby as essentially an adult's inner life in miniature. The baby would be thinking roughly what an adult in that situation would think. Wanting food, wanting affection, noticing things, finding things funny or confusing. McFarlane took this concept and detonated it. Stewie's inner life was not a small adult's inner life. It was something entirely different. It was a fully formed, elaborately articulated, operatically ambitious inner life that had no reference point in normal human development. The baby in the diaper, sitting in the high chair, being fed strained peas by his mother, was running calculations on world domination. He was designing delivery systems for biological agents. He was composing manifestos in his head while Lois sang him a song before bed. The humor came from the contrast, yes, but it came from something more specific than just contrast. It came from the absolute commitment to the concept. Stewie was not playing at being a villain. He was one, a real one, with real plans, real technology, real enemies, real ambitions. The joke was not that he wanted these things, but could not have them because he was a baby. The joke was that he could have them. He had the intelligence and the capability, and the only thing standing between Stewie Griffin and the subjugation of the human race was the sheer physical reality of being 12 months old. He could not drive. He could not reach the stove. He could not fill out the necessary paperwork. He was dependent on people he mostly despised for the most basic functions of daily life. He had to be carried. He had to be fed. He had to have his diaper changed by the woman he was actively scheming to assassinate. The gap between his ambitions and his circumstances was the source of most of his comedy, and it was bottomless. Seth MacFarlane based Stewie's voice on Rex Harrison, specifically his performance as Professor Henry Higgins in the 1964 film My Fair Lady. This is a precise and revealing choice. Higgins is a particular kind of British intellectual archetype, brilliant, condescending, completely certain of his own superiority, and operating at a level of self-confidence that most people would call arrogance, but that he would call simply accurate self-assessment. He talks about other people as problems to be solved. He treats interactions as opportunities to demonstrate his own correctness. Stewie inherited all of this. He spoke with the precision and economy of someone who considered every word carefully and had no patience for imprecision in others. His monologues about his plans for world domination had the cadence of formal addresses. When he expressed frustration, it was never simple frustration, it was carefully graduated contempt, delivered with full awareness of its own rhetorical effect. This voice coming from a baby's body was the joke, but it was also the character. The voice was not a costume, it was Stewie's actual interior. He genuinely was this person, this rigorous, ambitious, darkly funny, occasionally terrifying person who happened to exist inside a body that could not yet ride a bicycle. His relationship with Lois was the core emotional engine of everything in those first 3 seasons. He wanted to kill her, specifically and emphatically. This was not vague aggression. It was targeted. Episode after episode, he would be found working on new methods: a crossbow aimed through the kitchen door, a poison administered through her shampoo, an elaborate trap involving the garage door, and a carefully positioned spike. None of them ever worked, and the failures were usually funny in specific and inventive ways, but the attempts were always real. What was the joke actually about? What was the show saying by giving this baby this particular fixation? The most obvious reading is the simplest. It is the darkest possible version of the Oedipal dynamic in child psychology, played for complete absurdity. Freud spent a great deal of time writing about the complicated feelings children have about their parents, about the way early family relationships set templates for everything that follows. Stewie's murderous obsession with his mother was the show taking that theoretical framework and rendering it in the most extreme, most literal, most undeniably funny form possible. But there is another reading available. Stewie's hatred of Lois was not personal in the traditional sense. It was not that he found her a bad mother. In fact, Lois was a good mother to Stewie, by any external measure: attentive, loving, patient, present. His problem with her was that she kept interfering. Every time he was on the verge of a breakthrough, every time the time machine was calibrated, every time the death ray was charged, every time the mind control device was ready for testing, Lois would appear with a bottle or a toy or a declaration that it was bath time, and the whole operation would have to pause. She was an obstacle not because of who she was, but because of what she represented: the domestic, the mundane, the relentless demand of daily life to interrupt whatever grand thing you were trying to accomplish. Stewie's war with Lois was, at this level, a war with ordinariness itself, with the insistence that life must be small and regular and controlled, with the idea that feeding schedules and bedtimes and clean diapers were the relevant concerns when there was a planet to conquer. Every person who has ever had a big idea interrupted by the small demands of everyday life, who has had to stop mid-thought to answer an email, or pick up the kids, or deal with some small domestic emergency, will find something they recognize in Stewie's frustration, even if they would not phrase it as wanting to murder anyone about it. The dramatic irony that made the whole concept work was that Lois did not know. She had no idea. She walked through Stewie's plots like she was walking through her own house, because she was. Because she had no reason to suspect that her 1-year-old was a weapons specialist with a to-do list that included her elimination. She would step over his laser cannon without noticing it. She would dismantle part of his laboratory when she was tidying his room, genuinely believing she was tidying his room. She would hug him and he would stand there in her arms, teeth slightly gritted, recalculating. Brian was the exception. Brian could understand Stewie. He heard the actual words rather than the babbling. This made their relationship unique in the entire cast. Brian was the only person in the house who engaged with Stewie as he actually was rather than as a baby was supposed to be. Their early conversations were brief but sharp, with Brian acting as a kind of wry commentator on Stewie's plans, without ever quite endorsing or condemning them. The early seasons gave Stewie moments of genuine vulnerability that cut through the villainy with something unexpected. There were episodes where he showed real fear, not of anything strategic, but of things that babies are actually afraid of. The dark, being abandoned, losing Rupert, his teddy bear, who was always treated with a seriousness that both underscored and complicated his evil genius persona. For all his world domination ambitions, the loss of that stuffed bear could undo him in ways that nothing else could. This vulnerability was not a contradiction, it was the character. Stewie was a genuinely complex creation, someone simultaneously so far beyond his years as to be frightening and so thoroughly, irreducibly a baby that he could be brought low by the absence of a stuffed toy. The comedy lived in the gap between these two things. The warmth lived there too. His room deserves a moment. In the early seasons, Stewie's bedroom was his sanctuary and his laboratory both. Behind the child-appropriate surface, the crib, the mobile, the cheerful colors was a fully operational research and development facility. He had technology in there that would have been impressive anywhere. He had schematics on walls that looked like finger paintings until you got close enough. He had a weapons closet, a chemistry setup, a communications array, all of it hidden in plain sight inside a room that looked like a perfectly normal baby's room. This was one of the show's most consistent and most delightful visual jokes, the double reality of Stewie's space. And it spoke to something broader about the show's sensibility, which was always interested in what lay underneath surfaces. The Griffin house looked like a normal house. It was not a normal house. The Griffin family looked like a normal family. They were not a normal family. And Stewie's room looked like a normal baby's room. It was a base of operations for an aspiring despot. The other characters who came close to Stewie in those early seasons tended to exist in his orbit in ways that revealed him further. There was Bertram, the fellow genius baby who became a recurring rival in later seasons. There were the moments where Stewie interacted with children his own age and was visibly horrified by their simplicity. There were the interactions with school Stewie in the presence of conventional toddler development, doing his best not to reveal himself but barely concealing the contempt. The character worked at every level he was asked to work at, as physical comedy, as dialogue comedy, as character comedy, as a walking meditation on the gap between inner life and outward circumstance. He was the kind of original creation that other shows immediately started trying to copy and that nobody else ever quite got right, because the specific combination of elements, the commitment to the concept, the quality of the writing, the performance MacFarlane gave him was not replicable. For 3 seasons, Stewie Griffin was dangerous, unpredictable, hilariously murderous, and secretly tender. He was the most purely inventive thing about a show that had a lot of inventive things going for it. And in his own strange, diaper-wearing, world-dominating way, he was one of the most fully realized characters on American television. Section 6. Meg Griffin, the Invisible Daughter. Meg Griffin occupies a strange and somewhat uncomfortable position in the history of this show. She is the character who started out as the most relatable and ended up being the most misused, which is its own kind of story. But before we get to any of that, we need to spend time with who she actually was at the beginning. In the pilot and throughout the first season, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert. Chabert left after that first season due to scheduling conflicts with her other work. She was on Party of Five at the time. Mila Kunis auditioned for the replacement role and was eventually asked back multiple times, each time with specific direction from MacFarlane to slow down, to enunciate more, to find the particular cadence that Meg needed. Kunis has held the role ever since. Meg in those first 3 seasons was doing something very specific and very honest. She was a teenager who wanted to matter and kept coming in second, not because she was terrible at anything, not because she was irredeemably unpopular in some definitive way, just because she was ordinary, and the particular cruelty of being ordinary in high school is that ordinary does not get you very far. She was the oldest Griffin child, which meant she was supposed to be the most responsible. She was supposed to have some perspective that her younger siblings lacked. In practice, she just had more ways to be disappointed. She could see clearly what the social landscape of her school looked like, which meant she understood exactly where she stood in it and exactly what she would need to change to stand somewhere else. And she did not have the power or the confidence or the luck to make those changes happen. The earliest joke about Meg was not about her appearance. It was not about her worth. It was about her comparative interestingness in a family that was interesting in ways she simply was not. Her father was chaotic and entertaining in his chaos. Her mother was grounded and competent and occasionally surprising. Her baby brother was secretly an evil genius. Her dog could hold a conversation. Chris was odd but warmly so, and Meg was a teenage girl who wanted to be noticed at school. In that company, she faded. This fading was the joke, but it was also a compassionate joke. The show understood something true about what it feels like to be the ordinary one in an extraordinary family. To be the person who says the normal thing when everyone else says something weird or surprising or memorable. To watch your siblings get the interesting storylines while you get the B-plot. Meg was the B-plot made manifest as a character, and in the early seasons the show played this with enough self-awareness that it felt like it was in on the joke with her rather than just at her expense. There were moments in the early episodes where the show gave Meg real space to be a character. In the episode titled Where's the Show? From season 1 and in several others, Meg would have interactions with her family that were grounded and recognizably human. Peter, despite being unreliable as a father in numerous ways, could surprise her. There were small moments of genuine fatherly attention, almost always arrived at by accident, that landed differently than anything else in the episode. He was not a bad father because he did not love his daughter. He was a bad father in certain ways because his love expressed itself inconsistently and his awareness of her needs was often delayed. Lois was, if anything, more consistently present with Meg than Peter was, though that presence was complicated by its own dynamics. Lois wanted better for Meg in a way that sometimes communicated itself as dissatisfaction with who Meg currently was. The push toward self-improvement, the nudging toward confidence, the occasional suggestions that things might go better if Meg presented herself differently, all of this came from love, but love that was not always fully comfortable to receive. Meg's experience of her family was the experience of the person who sees everything clearly, but whose seeing is not particularly valued by the people around her. She was perceptive in a quiet way. She noticed things. She had feelings about those things that she articulated rarely, but that were real when they surfaced. Her relationship with the high school social hierarchy was drawn from something recognizable. Connie D'Amico, the popular girl who served as Meg's main tormentor, was not a character without motivation. She was doing what the social hierarchy required of her, which was to enforce its boundaries by making the people outside them feel the distance. It was unkind. It was also utterly ordinary cruelty of the kind that happens in high schools everywhere. What made Meg's situation resonate in those early seasons was that the show did not offer her a clean resolution. She did not find her tribe. She did not suddenly discover a talent that changed everything. She did not get the dramatic vindication scene that television usually gives to characters in her position. She just kept going. Kept showing up to school, kept trying to talk to boys who did not notice her, kept being slightly less interesting than everyone else in her family, and kept being okay-ish, in the way that most teenagers who are not having the time of their life are okay-ish surviving, finding small things to hold on to, waiting for life to get bigger. This was honest, a lot more honest than the alternative, which was to give Meg a triumphant storyline that would have felt false. Teenage awkwardness does not resolve in a single episode. Social invisibility does not evaporate because of one good moment. The show understood this, and in understanding it, it treated Meg with more respect than it is usually credited with. Her voice was important. Mila Kunis gave Meg a slightly flat, slightly tired delivery that was perfect for the character, the sound of someone who had said interesting things and had them go unheard enough times that she had started to expect not to be heard. It was not a self-pitying voice. It was a resigned one, with occasional flashes of the genuine person underneath when something surprised her enough to break through the resignation. The relationship with Stewie was minimal in the early seasons, which was accurate to the family dynamic. Stewie spent most of his time on his own projects or in Brian's company and had relatively little occasion to engage with his teenage sister. When they did share scenes, the contrast between them was one of the funnier things the show produced. The baby who was secretly the most intelligent person in the house, sitting across from the teenager who wanted very much to be seen and rarely was, both of them existing in the same family and experiencing it as entirely different places. Chris's relationship with Meg in the early seasons had the texture of real sibling dynamics, not particularly close, sometimes oblivious to each other, occasionally conspiring in the way that siblings will when their parents are the common problem to be managed. Chris liked Meg in the uncomplicated way that a younger brother likes an older sister he does not have very much in common with. He was not cruel to her. He was just present in the background, doing his own thing. What the early Meg storylines were actually about, at their best, was the universal experience of feeling like you are performing life for an audience that keeps looking the other way. She wanted to be chosen by friends, by boys, by her own family's attention, and she mostly was not. And the show found the comedy in this situation without ever suggesting that Meg's desire to be chosen was wrong or foolish or something she should simply get over. In that way, she was the character most clearly positioned as the audience's surrogate. The Griffins were extraordinary. Meg was the ordinary one looking at the extraordinary family from the inside. She was us, watching them. And in the early seasons, the show was gentle enough with her that this surrogate function felt like warmth rather than humiliation. Section 7, Chris Griffin, Quagmire, Joe, Cleveland, and the world of Spooner Street. Let us talk about the world that surrounded the Griffins, because that world was as carefully built as any of its residents, and it gave the show a depth that single-family stories often lack. Chris Griffin first. He was not as explored as his siblings, but he was not a placeholder either. Seth Green voiced him with a particular loose, ambling quality, the voice of someone who was in no particular hurry to arrive anywhere and who found everything around him mildly, pleasantly surprising. Chris was good-natured in the way that certain people are good-natured, not because they have worked at it or thought about it, but because that is simply the factory setting they arrived with. He had a genuine talent for drawing. This surfaced in early episodes and was treated as something real rather than a punchline. There was an episode in the first season where it became a central plot point. A visiting art critic noticed Chris's work and recognized something in it, and for a brief window, the show let Chris be special in a way that had nothing to do with the other Griffins and everything to do with his own specific ability. He was also, in certain ways, the most naturally generous of the Griffin children. He did not have Stewie's genius or Meg's self-awareness or the pretensions that came with both. He had a kind of uncomplicated warmth that made him easy to be around and occasionally easy to underestimate. His relationship with Peter had the specific quality of a son who loves his father without being particularly under any illusions about his father's capabilities. His social life at school was that of a boy who was not cool and not particularly bothered by not being cool, which put him in an interesting position relative to Meg, who desperately wanted to be cool and was constantly reminded that she was not. Chris occupied the same social tier and seemed to feel approximately nothing about it. This was either wisdom or obliviousness, and the show was probably correct to leave the question ambiguous. Now to the neighbors. The friends. The people who filled out the world of Spooner Street and made it feel inhabited rather than staged. Glenn Quagmire, voiced by MacFarlane himself, in a voice that owed something to 1950s. American masculinity smooth, slightly sleazy, carrying the cadence of a man who considered himself to be perpetually on the verge of something exciting happening. Quagmire was defined by his extraordinary, nearly supernatural success with women, a success that the show treated as both a joke and a given, a law of his particular universe that everyone else simply accepted. In the early seasons, Quagmire was a secondary player in the group dynamic at the Drunken Clam. He was the exotic one, the bachelor, the one whose apartment contained mysteries that the others preferred not to investigate too closely. His friendship with Peter was warm in the way of men who have been friends long enough that they have stopped needing reasons for it. They had history together that predated the show's beginning, and the show let you feel that history without always explaining it. What Quagmire represented, structurally, was the alternative. The life that Peter could theoretically have had if he had made different choices. The life without a mortgage and kids and a wife who expected things of him. This was not presented as obviously superior. The show understood that freedom without connection is its own kind of poverty, but it was presented as real. Quagmire's existence was not a failure. It was just a different set of pleasures and a different set of costs. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer who lived on Spooner Street, voiced by Patrick Warburton with a specific kind of gruff warmth. The voice of someone who had been through things but had not let those things define him in the way they might have. Joe was introduced as someone to be admired, someone whose physical situation had not dimmed anything about his presence or his capability. He solved cases. He was respected in the neighborhood. He was the kind of man that other men wish they had the straightforward decency of. His wife Bonnie, voiced by Jennifer Tilly with a perpetually fragile quality, was a different kind of presence. She was sweet and somewhat lost, someone managing her own difficulties while also managing the ongoing reality of being married to a man in Joe's situation. Their relationship was complicated in the early seasons in ways that felt real rather than dramatic, not in crisis, not perfectly happy, just two people doing their best in circumstances that required more of them than they had anticipated. Cleveland Brown, the most straightforwardly warm presence in the Drunken Clam group. Mike Henry voiced him with a patience and a gentleness that made Cleveland feel like the emotional anchor of the friend group, the one who was always going to be there, who was not going to let things get too far out of hand without trying to pull them back. His marriage to Loretta had its complications. She was sharper and more demanding and more dissatisfied with the life they had built than Cleveland was, and this tension was handled in early episodes with a care that acknowledged both perspectives without dismissing either. These characters and their households filled out the world of the show in ways that mattered. Without them, the Griffins existed in a vacuum. With them, the Griffins existed in a neighborhood, in a community, in the kind of suburban social ecosystem where everyone knows everyone's business whether they want to or not, where the sidewalks lead somewhere and the bar on the corner has regulars who have been regulars for decades. The Drunken Clam itself was a character, practically a member of the cast. A bar that looked like bars look in the early evening of a Tuesday when the only people there are the regulars, comfortable, slightly dim, smelling of beer and years of conversation. The booth in the back where Peter and his friends sat was not just a set. It was a place with the specific gravity that certain places have, the kind where you have been so many times that you sit in the same seat automatically and feel slightly wrong if someone else is already in it. The town of Quahog, beyond Spooner Street, was developed gradually over the first 3 seasons. There was James Woods Regional High School, where Meg and Chris attended, its name a reference to the actor who would go on to appear in multiple episodes in increasingly elaborate jokes about himself. There was the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter eventually worked, filling his days with a particular low-level satisfaction that suited him. There was the local news, anchored by Tom Tucker with a hair helmet that seemed architectural in its ambition. There was the mayor's office, the police department, the church, all the institutional bones of a small American city. None of it was New York or Los Angeles. None of it was glamorous or aspirational. It was the kind of place where people had been born and had not necessarily intended to stay but had found themselves staying anyway, because the staying was easier than the leaving and because what was here was not nothing. It was enough. Enough can be enough. The Rhode Island setting gave the show a specific regional flavor that kept it grounded in ways that a more generic suburban setting would not have allowed. New England has a particular texture, a particular relationship with weather, with history, with the kind of long-settled identity that comes from being one of the oldest parts of the country. MacFarlane peppered the early seasons with references to real Rhode Island geography and culture. Pawtucket, Newport, the proximity to Massachusetts, the specific character of that small state crowded by larger neighbors. This was more than local color. It was an argument that this story was happening somewhere real, not in a generic American suburb that could be anywhere. In a particular corner of the world that had its own history and its own identity, and that shaped the people who lived in it in specific ways. When you watch the early seasons and feel that the show has weight, that it is not just jokes stacked on jokes, but something with texture and gravity, a lot of that comes from the solidity of the world it built. A world that felt inhabited. A world that felt like the places that most of its audience had come from or were currently living in. A world where ordinary life was happening to ordinary people, with extraordinary chaos occasionally breaking through, and somehow holding together anyway. Section 8. The Writing Room, Sharp Comedy with a Heart Underneath. A show does not become what Family Guy became at its best without a group of writers who understood exactly what they were trying to do. The writing room of the early seasons was one of the most talented collections of comedic minds assembled for an animated series, and the things they got right deserve to be examined carefully. Seth MacFarlane assembled his original writing team with specific intentions. He wanted people who shared his sensibility, who understood the balance he was going for between sharp comedy and genuine feeling, between the willingness to go anywhere for a joke and the discipline to know when the joke had gone far enough. The original writers included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. Some of these names are more recognizable than others. Gary Janetti went on to a wide variety of other work in television. Matt Weitzman would become one of the key architects of American Dad, which is a story we will come back to. Mike Barker similarly moved on to American Dad. The collective intelligence and craft of these people in those first 3 seasons is not something you can simply recreate by hiring new writers. What they understood, collectively, was that humor has a delivery system, and that delivery system matters as much as the joke itself. An identical punchline can land completely differently depending on the setup, the timing, the emotional context, the specific word choices in the sentences leading up to it. The early Family Guy writers were working at a level of precision that only becomes visible in retrospect when you watch the later seasons and feel the absence of it. The cutaway gag was their most famous tool and their most frequently misunderstood one. In critical discussions of the show, the cutaway is almost always treated as either the show's signature strength or its primary weakness, depending on which era of the show the person is discussing. But in the early seasons, the cutaway was neither a strength nor a weakness. It was simply a tool, used well. Here is what made the early cutaways work. They were specific. They were not chosen randomly from a list of pop culture references. They were chosen because they fit the precise emotional moment in the story that was happening. A character would say something, and the cutaway would comment on that something, not just change the subject, but extend or invert or complicate what had just been said. The connection between the setup and the cutaway was not always obvious, but it was always there if you looked for it. They were also short. The early cutaways lasted seconds. They delivered their joke and immediately returned you to the story. The story was always primary. The cutaway was always supplemental. This ratio was the whole secret, and it was the ratio that later seasons completely inverted. Beyond the cutaways, the writing room had a gift for character consistency that made the comedy land harder than it would have otherwise. Comedy that comes from character, from the specific quirks and blind spots and obsessions of a particular person, is funnier than comedy that comes from nowhere, because you recognize it. You have been waiting for this particular character to do or say this particular thing, and when they do, the recognition doubles the laugh. The early Family Guy writers knew their characters. They knew that Peter's brand of stupidity was specific. He was not equally dumb about everything. He had areas of surprising competence and vast areas of reliable incomprehension, and the jokes were funniest when they found those areas with precision. They knew that Brian's observations were funniest when they were both accurate and slightly too honest for the situation. They knew that Stewie's plans worked best when they were treated with complete seriousness, when the show committed to the internal logic of the villain baby character rather than winking at the audience about how absurd it was. The musical numbers were another element of the early writing that deserves more appreciation than it typically gets. MacFarlane's genuine love for classic Hollywood music, for big band, for Broadway, for the swinging orchestral pop of the Rat Pack era found its way into the show in specific and well-executed ways. The Road to Rhode Island episode produced the song Road to Rhode Island, a genuine musical number in the tradition of the Bing Crosby and Bob Hope films that inspired it, and it was good. Not parody good. Actually good. The melody worked, the lyrics landed. MacFarlane's voice was equal to the material. This was a recurring element that set the show apart from most of its competition. When Family Guy did a musical number, it was not usually a joke about doing a musical number. It was a genuine musical number that also had jokes in it. The two things coexisted because MacFarlane had the musical literacy to make them coexist. The result was a show that could shift gears from broad physical comedy to a carefully orchestrated song and back again without losing its footing. The writing room also had a specific and productive relationship with darkness. Family Guy was always willing to go to dark places, to make jokes about death, about disability, about failure, about the specific sadnesses that most television preferred to leave alone. But in the early seasons, this darkness was handled with a craft that kept it from becoming merely grim. There is a difference between dark humor and humor that uses darkness as a shortcut. Dark humor requires the darkness to serve the joke to illuminate something, to find something funny in a place where people do not usually expect to laugh. Humor that uses darkness as a shortcut just throws something upsetting at the audience and waits for a reaction. The early Family Guy did the first thing. It found genuine comedy in uncomfortable places without stripping those places of their actual uncomfortable qualities. The episode Da Boom from Season 2, which was a post-apocalyptic parody set on New Year's Eve 1999 when the Griffin family builds a bunker in anticipation of Y2K, is a good example of this. The premise was dark civilization collapsing, people mutating, the world ending, and the show committed to the darkness entirely while somehow making it hilarious throughout. The jokes were not dark despite the context. They were dark because of the context. The grimness was the fuel. The writing also had a quality of specificity in its pop culture references that has been lost in the retelling of the show's legacy. People now talk about Family Guy as the show that makes random pop culture references, and that is an accurate description of the later show. But in the early seasons, the references were not random. They were chosen. They were chosen to land precisely in the consciousness of a particular audience, people in their 20s and 30s in 1999 and 2000, who had grown up on a specific cultural diet of television and film and music from the 1970s and 1980s, who would feel the particular jolt of recognition that comes from seeing something you thought only you remembered showing up on national television. The difference between a reference and an observation is everything. A reference says, I know this thing too. An observation says, this thing means something. Here is what it means. The early Family Guy was making observations. The references were the delivery mechanism for the observations. And the observations were usually smart, and usually funny, and usually right. The writing room operated in a state of sustained creative investment during those first 3 seasons that is visible in every episode. The show was trying. Not in the sense of effortfully straining, but in the sense of genuinely caring whether the thing it was making was good, whether the story worked, whether the character was true, whether the joke was worth it. This care is the thing that you can feel and cannot always name when you watch the early seasons. Something about the precision of the choices, something about the consistency of the characters, something about the way the humor and the heart coexist without either one undermining the other. It is the difference between a show that is professionally executed and a show that is genuinely alive. For 3 seasons, Family Guy was genuinely alive. The writing room made it that way. Section 9. The cultural moment Family Guy. Captured. Something needs to be said about timing, about what the world was like when Family Guy arrived and why that context mattered. The show premiered on the 31st of January, 1999. This date puts it precisely at the hinge of 2 eras in American popular culture. The 1990s were technically still happening, but the sensibility was changing. The internet was becoming a thing that people used, though it was not yet a thing that defined daily life the way it would come to do. The era of peak TV was still years away. This was still a time when a primetime network show on a Sunday night could realistically reach tens of millions of viewers in real time, and what it said could be discussed the next day in offices and classrooms by people who had all seen the same thing at the same moment. The animated comedy landscape in 1999 was specific in ways that Family Guy's arrival disrupted. The Simpsons had been on for a decade and was still one of the best shows on television, but there were signs that its absolute dominance was beginning to soften slightly. South Park had been on Comedy Central since 1997 and had established that there was an appetite for animated comedy that was genuinely transgressive, that went to places The Simpsons would not go, that said things network television would not allow. Family Guy entered this landscape and did something specific. It was network television, Fox, not cable, but it pushed at the boundaries of what network television would permit in ways that had not been done before in this format. It was more explicit than The Simpsons, more willing to be offensive, more comfortable with darkness. And it did this while still maintaining the emotional architecture of a family, show the relationships, the warmth, the basic decency that held the Griffins together even when everything else was falling apart. This balance was what made the show a phenomenon rather than a cult item. South Park was a cult item in 1999, beloved by a specific audience that actively sought it out. Family Guy aired after the Super Bowl and got 22 million viewers before anyone had decided to seek it out. It was able to do this because underneath the transgression, underneath the adult humor, underneath the willingness to go to dark places, there was still a recognizable family. Peter and Lois were still a couple whose marriage you could root for. The kids were still kids whose outcomes you cared about. The generation that grew up watching the early Family Guy had a specific relationship with the show that younger viewers who came to it through streaming or meme compilations do not quite share. For people who were teenagers or young adults in 1999 and 2000, this show arrived at a particular moment in their development, a moment when they were old enough to appreciate the adult content, but young enough to still feel the pull of the family at the center of it, old enough to get the jokes, young enough to still recognize something of their own families in the Griffins. McFarlane described the show at the time as a modern vaudeville, and this description is more precise than it might seem. Vaudeville was a form of popular entertainment built on variety, on the rapid succession of different kinds of acts, different kinds of humor, different tones, and registers within a single performance. A vaudeville show could shift from slapstick to sentiment to song and back again within the span of a few minutes. And the audience came for exactly this variety, for the sense that anything could happen next. This is what the early Family Guy felt like. The speed of the show, the rapid gear changes between different kinds of humor, between absurdism and character comedy, and sentimental moments, and musical interludes, and gross-out jokes and pointed satire, was exhilarating in a way that slower, more consistent shows could not match. You never knew what was coming. The show kept surprising you with what it was willing to do, and the surprises were usually good ones. The show also arrived at a moment when American family life was being examined from multiple angles in popular culture, and it added a specific voice to that examination. The late 1990s saw an enormous amount of cultural hand-wringing about the state of the American family, about what had changed since previous generations, about what had been lost, about what the costs of that loss were. Family Guy engaged with this conversation directly and, ironically, most clearly in its theme song. The question posed by the theme, "Where are those good old-fashioned values?" was not a question the show was going to answer comfortably. The Griffins were not a model of good old-fashioned values. They were a model of what families actually look like when the performance of good old-fashioned values gives way to the reality of daily life, with all its chaos and inconsistency and love and failure. But the question was real. The show was not simply mocking the people who asked it. Seth MacFarlane was, by his own description, someone who cared about the values the show satirized. He genuinely believed in family. He genuinely believed in love. He was just honest satirically, comedically, brutally honest about the gap between the ideal and the reality. This was the cultural function the show served at its best. Not to tear down the idea of family. Not to make a case against love or loyalty or the effort to build something good with people you have chosen, but to hold up the messy reality of all of it, the ways people fail, the people they love, the ways love survives failure, the ways families hold together through sheer determination, even when logic might suggest they should not, and find something both honest and funny in it. That is a harder thing to do than it looks. The show did it for 3 seasons with remarkable consistency. Section 10, The Cancellation, The Comeback, and What They Meant. Few stories in the history of American television are as genuinely improbable as the story of how Family Guy came back from the dead. Let us walk through it slowly, because the details matter. The show premiered in January 1999. The first season drew strong numbers and established the show as a new and interesting entry in the Fox lineup. But almost immediately, the network started making decisions that would prove fatal to its initial run. In the second season, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 o'clock. This placed it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, which was at that point one of the most popular comedies on television and pulling enormous numbers in exactly the demographic that advertisers cared about. Family Guy, still finding its audience, took a significant hit. Fox responded by moving the show again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it went up against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC. The game show had been a cultural phenomenon in 2000, breaking records and dominating its time period. Family Guy lost that matchup badly. Fox kept shuffling the show around different nights, different time slots, with very little notice given to viewers who were trying to follow it. Every time the audience started to find the show in a new place, it was moved again. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy for what appeared to be the final time. There was no particularly dramatic announcement. The show simply stopped. The writers and cast moved on to other projects. The original writing team scattered. MacFarlane was in discussions about developing other work. For all practical purposes, the show was over. But something unusual was happening in the home video market and in the cable ratings. Cartoon Network had acquired the rights to air Family Guy reruns on their Adult Swim block, and they had acquired those rights for almost nothing. The show was canceled. Nobody wanted it. The network that had canceled it twice was not placing any particular value on its reruns. So Adult Swim got one of the best deals in cable television history without knowing it. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003, and almost immediately, the ratings were extraordinary. The show became the most watched program on the block. It was dominating its time period against both cable and broadcast competition. It was beating late-night programming that had been established for years. And according to Cartoon Network's own press release at the time, Family Guy ranked first in its time period among adults and men in the 18 to 34 demographic, beating both The Late Show with David Letterman and The Tonight Show with Jay Leno in head-to-head competition. In that same group, the Adult Swim numbers alone would have been enough to make people notice, but they were occurring simultaneously with something in the home video market that nobody had predicted. The complete first and second seasons of Family Guy were released on DVD the same week the show premiered on Adult Swim. Within 1 month, the DVD set had sold 400,000 copies. Within the year, it had moved 2.2 million units. This made it the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and the second highest-selling television DVD in history at that point, behind only the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. Think about what this meant. People who had grown up watching the show when it originally aired were buying it on DVD and rewatching it. People who had never seen it were discovering it through Adult Swim and then buying the DVDs to see the episodes they had missed. The word of mouth was operating in real time, spreading through a particular demographic, young adults, college students, the late-night cable-watching crowd with extraordinary speed and intensity. An online petition to revive the show gathered more than 111,000 signatures by May of 2003. This was in 2003. Social media did not exist in the way it does now. The internet was still something you accessed deliberately from a desktop computer. Gathering 111,000 signatures on an online petition required a level of organized, motivated fandom that was genuinely remarkable. Fox took notice. Of course they took notice. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice was watching it become one of the most popular programs in cable television's late-night history. They were watching the DVD sales accumulate into numbers that even the biggest primetime shows would not have been embarrassed by. They were receiving the fan petition, and they had to confront the obvious conclusion. They had made a mistake. On the 20th of May 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy. The show was coming back. This was, by any accounting, unprecedented. A canceled television show being revived based on DVD sales and cable reruns, this had not happened before. It has been followed by several similar revivals since, but Family Guy was the first. It set the template. The fourth season premiered on the 1st of May 2005. 11.85 million viewers watched the return. According to the New York Times, the hype was real, and the audience showed up to validate it. For the people who had been there from the beginning, who had watched the original 3 seasons, who had been part of the cult that developed on Adult Swim, who had been watching the DVD sets and telling their friends the return was a genuine event, something that television did not usually give you, a second chance, a correction of an injustice, a show that had been taken away before its time getting another run at doing what it had been doing. What made this story matter beyond the television industry trivia is what it said about the relationship between a show and its audience. Family Guy was not brought back by a network that suddenly decided it was artistically important. It was brought back by commercial logic, by the undeniable math of cable ratings and DVD sales, and a fan petition that represented a specific and passionate audience. The network followed the money, as networks do. But what the audience was doing was not simply purchasing a product they liked. They were voting, collectively and over time, for a specific sensibility. For the thing that Family Guy at its best was the smart, warm, transgressive, character-driven comedy that the first 3 seasons had delivered. They were saying, in the language available to them, that this thing had mattered, that it had said something that resonated, that it deserved to exist. The 3-year gap between the cancellation and the return was not nothing. MacFarlane himself acknowledged that the constant instability of the show's situation, being canceled twice, never given a stable place in the schedule, always uncertain about its future, had cost it something. The original writing team had scattered. The rhythm of the show had been broken. The continuity of vision that the first 3 seasons had maintained was disrupted in ways that took time to partially recover. The show that came back in 2005 was the same show and not the same show. It carried the same characters, the same setting, the same basic sensibility, but it was working with a different team in a different context, and the differences showed sometimes immediately, sometimes gradually, in ways that would only become fully apparent over many more seasons. But on that night in May 2005, when 11.85 million people watched Family Guy return after 3 years away, none of that was the story. The story was that something worth preserving had been preserved, that the audience had demanded the continuation of something good, and the demand had been answered. That is not always how television works. Sometimes the things worth preserving disappear anyway. The fact that this particular show came back is worth appreciating for itself, independent of everything that happened after. Section 11. The episodes that defined what the show was. Let us take our time with specific episodes, because the best way to understand what a show was is to look carefully at its finest moments. Theory can only take you so far. The actual work is always the clearest argument. Road to Rhode Island. Season 2, Episode 13. Written by Gary Janetti. Directed by Dan Povenmire. This is the episode that IGN gave a perfect score of 10 out of 10, one of only 3 Family Guy episodes to ever receive that rating from the publication. It is also the episode that launched one of the show's most beloved recurring franchises, The Road to Episodes, and the one that proved definitively that Brian and Stewie worked as a duo. The premise was straightforward. Brian flies to Palm Springs to pick up Stewie from his grandparents' house. They miss their flight back to Rhode Island. They have to make the journey by other means. That is all. The plot is essentially an excuse to put these two characters on the road together and see what happens. What happens is one of the best episodes the show ever produced. The episode committed to its story in a way that the later seasons rarely did. There were cutaways, but they were brief, and they earned their place by commenting on the main narrative rather than replacing it. The main story was the specific comedy of Brian and Stewie's dynamic, which was sharper and stranger and funnier than any cutaway could match, because it came from character rather than from randomness. Brian's backstory was revealed for the first time here. His mother, the puppy mill where he was born, the Henderson family who adopted him and then stopped looking for him when he went missing, trusting the situation to God's will and moving on. The scene where Brian and Stewie visit the puppy mill and find his mother's carcass being used as a table was one of the most carefully calibrated tonal moments in the entire series. It was genuinely dark, genuinely sad, and somehow also funny, because the show found the exact angle from which the darkness became something else without denying what it actually was. The musical number that closed the episode, the song Road to Rhode Island, performed in the style of the old Bing Crosby and Bob Hope road films, was a genuine achievement, not a parody of a musical number. An actual musical number that worked on its own terms while also serving as a comedic callback to the journey the characters had just completed. The melody was good, the arrangement was good, McFarlane's voice was good. The lyrics were funny and also touching in the way that the best songs can be when the emotional context is right. The B-plot, in which Lois convinces Peter to watch marriage counseling videos that turn out to be pornography, was consistently funny and kept the episode from being too weight-bearing in its main story. It understood its own job, which was to keep the comedy active while the A-plot did something more emotionally interesting. Road to Rhode Island proved something that the show sometimes forgot in later years, that its best material came from character, not from the randomness of cutaways. Not from the transgression of saying something outrageous, from the specific, irreducible personalities of the people it had created, put into situations that tested those personalities. The episode also made a quiet case for what Brian actually was, not just the voice of reason, not just Peter's sidekick, but a character with genuine interior complexity, someone who carried things from his past that he had not fully resolved, who was capable of grief and who could be made vulnerable by exactly the right discovery in exactly the right moment. The Perfect Castaway, Season 4. This was the show's first season back after cancellation, and this episode served partly as a reassurance to the audience that the characters they had missed were still themselves. The premise involved Peter being stranded on a deserted island after a fishing accident, being presumed dead, and returning to discover that Lois had married Brian. The episode worked as a comedy of mistaken assumptions and escalating complications, but what it really was about was the Peter-Brian friendship and the Peter-Lois relationship being tested in ways that confirmed both of them. Brian marrying Lois was the show acting on the thing it had always hinted at: Brian's feelings for Lois, and immediately, definitively committing to the position that these feelings, however real, were not where the story lived. The story lived in Peter and Lois. It had always lived there. Brian's love for Lois was genuine but displaced. The love of a man for a woman he cannot have, made stranger and sadder by the fact that he is also her dog. The episode handled the resolution: Peter coming back, Lois choosing Peter, Brian accepting this with unexpected grace. Brian's acceptance was not reluctant or barely concealed. It was real. He had known on some level where this was going to end up. He was glad for his friend. The friendship mattered more than the possibility that had briefly existed, and the episode let him have that dignity. Brian and Stewie, Season 8. This is the episode that remains, for many people, the definitive statement of what the show could be when it stopped relying on cutaway gags and just let its characters talk. The premise was almost absurdly simple. Brian and Stewie get locked in a bank vault on a Saturday. They have to spend the night there. They talk. The episode had no cutaways. None. For a show that had by this point built its entire identity around the cutaway gag, the choice to spend a full episode without one was either brave or desperate, depending on how you looked at it. It turned out to be brave. What the episode gave you was the fullest version of the Brian and Stewie friendship that the show had ever committed to film. They talked about everything. About their lives. About their friendship. About what they meant to each other. About the things they were afraid of. Brian revealed that he kept a gun in a safety deposit box. That there had been times when the idea of using it on himself had not been entirely abstract. This was not played for drama. It was delivered with the flat, slightly embarrassed honesty of someone who has decided to be truthful about something they have not been truthful about before. It was devastating in the way that real admissions are devastating, not through melodrama, but through the simple act of saying the thing out loud. Stewie's response was what made the scene. He did not panic. He did not moralize. He did not offer the reassuring platitudes that the situation might have seemed to call for. He just said that he would not know what to do without Brian. Simply, directly. In the voice of a 1-year-old British supervillain who had, over many years of friendship, apparently developed something genuine for this complicated dog. The episode won critical acclaim and is consistently placed among the finest episodes the show produced across its entire run. It is also the clearest evidence that when the writers trusted their characters enough to let them simply be themselves, the show did not need anything else. It did not need jokes. It did not need chaos. It needed characters who had enough inside them to sustain a conversation, and Brian and Stewie had exactly that. Blue Harvest, Season 6, the Season 6 premiere. This was the Star Wars parody episode, the Griffin family retelling A New Hope with themselves in the roles. Peter as Han Solo, Lois as Princess Leia, Chris as Luke Skywalker. George Lucas had given the show explicit permission to do Star Wars parodies after revealing he was a fan, and the first of these parodies was a genuine delight. What made it work was not just the parody itself, which was well constructed and hit the familiar marks with precision and affection. What made it work was the show's genuine love for what it was parodying. The Star Wars universe was not being mocked here. It was being celebrated through a very specific lens. McFarlane's own enthusiasm for the source material he is, by his own admission, a significant Star Wars fan came through in every scene. The jokes worked because they came from a place of deep familiarity and affection rather than from the cynical distance of someone making fun of something they do not care about. The episode also managed to maintain the characters' personalities even while putting them in costume. Peter as Han Solo was still Peter, still impulsive, still fundamentally well-meaning, still in slightly over his head and managing it with more confidence than the situation warranted. Chris as Luke was still Chris, still slightly bewildered, still earnest in a way that made you root for him even when you were not sure he fully understood what he was doing. When the show did this, when it found ways to use its characters' specific personalities as the source of the comedy rather than as mere costuming, it was at its absolute best, the greatest love affair ever. An early season episode in which Peter and Lois attended a marriage counseling session and were forced to confront, directly and without irony, why they were together and what they had built. The episode was funny, as the show always was, but it was also genuinely willing to let the characters be vulnerable, to let Peter say things he would normally never say, to let Lois hear them and respond honestly. Episodes like this one were the show's argument that it was more than the sum of its jokes, that underneath the chaos, there was a marriage worth examining, a love story worth taking seriously even in its most imperfect form. Section 12, What Family Guy Was Actually About. We have been walking through this world for a while now, through the characters and the history and the specific episodes that defined what the show was. Let us use the time we have left to say plainly what all of it was actually about, underneath the surface, underneath the jokes, underneath the chaos. Family Guy was about the gap, not any single gap, but the gap as a category of human experience, the gap between who you intended to be and who you turned out to be. The gap between the life you imagined and the life you are actually living. The gap between how much you love someone and how often you show it in ways they can recognize. The gap between the family you set out to create and the family you actually have. Peter Griffin lived in this gap every single day. He was a man who genuinely loved his family and genuinely failed them in daily and accumulating ways. Not because he did not care, because caring and being good at caring are two entirely different skills, and he had the first one without the second. His gap was between his intentions and his execution. He meant well, he did badly, he tried to fix it, he meant well again. This is not a cartoon problem. This is one of the most common experiences in human life. Lois Griffin's gap was subtler. She had made a choice to leave wealth and expectation behind and build something with Peter, and she had made it with clear eyes, and she had no regrets about it in any fundamental sense. But the choice had costs that she had not fully anticipated, costs she absorbed quietly, costs that she occasionally felt but rarely named aloud. Her gap was between the life she was living and the life she might have lived. A gap she kept choosing to close by continuing to choose the life she had. Brian Griffin's gap was between who he presented himself as and who he actually was, between the intellectual he performed and the person he could not quite manage to be, between the novel he was going to write and the novel that kept not being written. His gap was the most consciously felt of all of them. He knew it was there, he was smart enough to see it clearly, and he was exactly not smart enough about himself to never quite figure out how to close it. Stewie Griffin's gap was the most absurd version of everyone else's. He was a genius trapped in a body that could not tie its own shoes. He had ambitions that were genuinely cosmic, and capabilities that were genuinely extraordinary, and the entire physical reality of being 12 months old stood between him and acting on any of it. His gap was between his interior and his exterior in the most complete and irreducible way. He was what he was, and what he was could not be expressed in the world he inhabited. Meg Griffin's gap was the quietest and perhaps the most painful. She wanted to matter to the people around her, and she kept not mattering quite enough. Not because she was unworthy of mattering, because the family she was part of was too chaotic, too self-involved, too caught up in its own gaps to reliably create space for hers. Her gap was between how much she deserved to be seen and how often she actually was. These gaps are why the show resonated the way it did in its first 3 seasons. They are why 22 million people watched the premiere. They are why millions more discovered the show on Adult Swim and bought the DVDs and signed the petition and kept coming back even after the show had been canceled twice. They recognized something in the Griffins. Not because the Griffins were like them, exactly, but because the Griffins were feeling something they felt, living with something they lived with. The theme of the show, stated directly in the opening song that every episode began with, was the longing for something better than what we have. Good old-fashioned values. Values on which we used to rely. This longing was not ironic. It was genuine. And the joke and the sadness was that the family asking the question was the least equipped to answer it. But here is what the early show understood about this situation that the later seasons mostly forgot. The Griffins were asking the question genuinely because they genuinely meant well. The asking was not performance. The longing was not affectation. Peter wanted to be a good father and kept failing to be one, but the wanting was real. Lois wanted her family to be good to each other and spent enormous energy trying to make that happen, even when it was a losing battle. Brian wanted to be the person he told himself he was, and the wanting was part of why the pretension was lovable rather than simply insufferable. There is a line of thinking about the show that says it was a satire that the Griffins were meant to illustrate everything wrong with a certain kind of American family, and that their dysfunction was the target. There is truth in this, but it is not the whole truth, and it misses the thing that made the show warm rather than cold. A satire distances itself from its target. It observes from the outside. It identifies the flaws and holds them up for examination with a certain remove that allows the audience to feel superior to what they are watching. Family Guy, at its best, did not do this. It was inside the Griffins, not outside them. It felt their gaps from the inside out. It understood them from a position of genuine affection. And that affection, that warmth, was what made the jokes hurt in the right way instead of the wrong one. When Peter did something terrible and then came back and apologized, the apology worked emotionally, dramatically, because the show had not spent the whole episode treating Peter as a subject for analysis. It had spent the episode with him, in his perspective, feeling what he felt. His contrition at the end had earned weight because we had been alongside him the whole time. This is what the show ultimately was when it was most fully itself. A portrait of people who were trying, people who were falling short of their own standards, who were living with the gap between their intentions and their actions, who were making a kind of love work despite everything it had to overcome. Not a perfect love, not a clean story, but something real and something worth caring about. The cutaway gags were never the point. The controversy was never the point. The outrageous humor and the transgressive jokes were never the point. They were the delivery system. They were the way the show made itself entertaining enough to carry the weight of what it was actually saying. What it was actually saying was this: love is complicated, imperfect, inconsistent, and worth having anyway. Families are difficult and dysfunctional, and sometimes genuinely hard to be inside. People fail the people they love all the time, and then they try again, and then they fail again, and then they try again. This cycle is not a failure. It is what love looks like in practice. It is what family looks like in practice. The Griffins, at their best, were evidence of this. Not good people. Exactly, the show was too honest for that. But people who kept trying. People who kept coming back. People who, despite everything, still sang together at the piano in the living room at the end of the day. Lucky there is a Family Guy. Lucky there is a man who positively can do all the things that make us laugh and cry. He is a Family Guy. The show named itself after something: the family man, the man who is defined by the family he has and the family he is still trying to be good enough for. And in those first 3 seasons, before everything else happened, it was genuinely about that thing, about the weight and the warmth of it, about what it costs to be someone that other people are depending on and what it gives you in return. That is what Family Guy was. That is what it was before the cutaways took over and the characters changed and the show became something different from the thing it had been built to be. And somewhere in all the jokes and the chaos and the chicken fights and the baby with the laser cannons and the talking dog who could not quite finish his novel, that original thing was always there, hidden sometimes, easy to miss if you were not paying attention. But there, as real and as warm as the moment Peter sat down next to Lois at the piano and looked at her the way he only ever looked at her. That is the show that millions of people loved. That is the show that people watched until 2 in the morning on Adult Swim and bought on DVD and signed petitions to bring back. That is the show that, even now, in the reruns and the clips and the memory of people who were watching it in the right moment, still has that quality of something that mattered. That is what Family Guy was actually about. And that is where we will rest tonight. If you have made it this far, then you have really spent some time with this, and I genuinely appreciate that. This kind of deep, unhurried exploration of something you love is exactly what this channel is built to do. Every show, every story, every world worth caring about has this kind of depth underneath it if you look carefully enough. If you enjoyed this, the single most useful thing you can do is hit subscribe. It is free, it keeps the channel going, and it means the next video finds you instead of missing you entirely. And if you have a topic you would love to see explored in this same slow, detailed, comfortable way, leave it in the comments. Your ideas are genuinely where a lot of this channel's direction comes from. Take care of yourselves, get some rest, and we will do this again soon. End of script. Fall asleep to what Family Guy was actually about. Section 13, the voice cast and what they brought to the show. A script is a set of possibilities. The voice cast is what turns those possibilities into something real. Family Guy had one of the most remarkable voice casts in the history of animated television, and the chemistry between these performers, their timing, their range, the way they played off each other even when they were recording in separate booths, was responsible for a significant portion of what made the show work. Seth MacFarlane voiced 4 major characters on the show simultaneously: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. This is an extraordinary workload by any standard, and the fact that all 4 characters remained distinctly themselves, had their own vocal identity, their own timing, their own emotional register was a genuine achievement. Most voice actors who play multiple characters on the same show produce at least some overlap, some sonic similarity that reminds you they are coming from the same source. MacFarlane found a way to make each voice its own complete thing. Peter's voice came from that security guard at RISD. It was a specific, particular thing, not a cartoon voice, not a broad caricature, but something grounded in a real person's actual way of moving through speech. It had rhythm. It had personality. It communicated something about Peter's relationship with the world before he said anything in particular. Stewie's voice was based on Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady, but MacFarlane transformed it into something entirely his own. The clipped British precision, the withering contempt, the way certain syllables got extra emphasis as a form of theatrical underlining. And underneath all of that, the ability to shift register entirely for moments of genuine vulnerability, the voice that emerged when Stewie was afraid of something, or missing Rupert, or confronted with something he had not planned for. Those shifts were what made Stewie a character rather than a shtick. Brian was McFarlane at his most unguarded, which made the character's warmth and the character's occasional insufferableness both feel equally real. When Brian said something genuinely kind, it landed as genuine kindness because the voice was not performing kindness. When Brian said something self-important and hollow, that landed too, because the same absence of performance made the hollowness audible. Quagmire was perhaps the most interesting purely as a vocal exercise, a caricature that managed to be funny without being contemptible, which required a very specific calibration of energy. Too much would have made him a joke. Too little and he was just vaguely unpleasant. McFarlane found the line and maintained it. Alex Borstein as Lois was one of the great, underappreciated voice performances in animation history. She brought the character to life with a commitment and a range that the role required. Lois occupied more emotional territory than any other character on the show, and Borstein was present in every register. The warmth was warm. The exasperation was real exasperation. The moments of genuine hurt and genuine joy and genuine exhaustion all landed as the real versions of those things rather than animated approximations. Her Emmy win was for a reason, but honestly the whole run of her work as Lois deserved recognition. There is a quality in Borstein's performance that makes you forget you are listening to a voice actress. You are just listening to Lois Griffin, who happens to be talking in your ear. Seth Green as Chris brought a specific sweetness to a character who could easily have been nothing but comic relief. The slightly ambling quality of Chris's speech, the way sentences ended on slight upturns as if he was always a little uncertain about whether he had said the right thing, the genuine warmth behind even the dumb moments. All of this came from Green's specific understanding of who Chris was and what he was there to do. Mila Kunis as Meg was doing something subtle and consistent that only becomes fully apparent when you pay close attention to it over many episodes. Meg's voice was never self-pitying, even when the writing might have pushed in that direction. Kunis kept a certain flatness, not lifelessness, but the specific flatness of someone who has decided to manage their expectations downward as a form of self-protection. This flatness made the moments when Meg was genuinely surprised or genuinely pleased stand out more sharply, because you had been calibrated to her lower register and the elevation felt significant. The guest voices across the early seasons were chosen with the same care that characterized the show's approach to everything in those years. McFarlane and his team were selective about who they invited into the world they had built. The guests fit. They understood their role. They did not overwhelm the regular cast or distort the show's tone by bringing in too much of their own external personality. The technical aspect of voice acting that most people never think about is that the performers in animation are recording alone. They are not in a room together, feeding off each other's energy, responding to each other in real time. They are in a booth with a script and a director and their own imagination, and they have to create the impression of genuine interaction with people who are not present. The Family Guy voice cast made this look easy, which is the best argument for how hard they were actually working. The chemistry between Peter and Lois felt real because both performers had done the work of internalizing their characters so thoroughly that the interaction emerged naturally even in isolation. The specific way Brian would react to one of Peter's proclamations, the exact phrasing of the dry observation, the precise timing of the pause before it was the result of McFarlane playing Brian against his own memory of playing Peter, and getting the relationship right in his head before getting it right on tape. This is the invisible labor of animation voice work, and it produces the feeling of a world that actually exists. A world where the people in it have a history with each other that the audience can feel without being told about. Section 14, the animation and what it communicated. There is a visual language to Family Guy that the discourse around the show rarely engages with seriously, but that was doing real work in those early seasons. The character designs were specific. Peter's proportions, the significant belly, the small eyes, the particular way he stood with a kind of settled groundedness that communicated someone who was comfortable in his body, even if that body was not conventionally attractive, said something about him before he opened his mouth. He looked like someone who had made peace with himself. Someone who was not performing any version of attractiveness or authority, he just was. Lois's design was deliberately conventional in a way that contrasted with her interior. She looked like a sitcom wife. The red hair, the trim figure, the practical clothes, all of this corresponded to a visual archetype that television audiences would immediately recognize and categorize. This was the joke and also the character. She looked like what she was supposed to be, and the show spent its time revealing what she actually was. Stewie was a visual argument for the show's central concept. He was drawn like a baby, perfectly. The proportions were accurate to real infant anatomy in ways that most animated babies are not. The large head-to-body ratio, the tiny limbs, the round features. He was drawn to be recognizable as an infant before he opened his mouth. And then he opened his mouth. The contrast between what he looked like and what he was did not require any setup. It was built into the character design itself. The early seasons, particularly seasons 2 and 3, which were handled by Rough Draft Studios, had an animation quality that deserves appreciation. The characters moved with a looseness and expressiveness that later seasons, with their cleaner and more digital production, did not quite match. There was a handmade quality to it. Nothing was perfectly smooth. Characters had a slightly rough vitality to their movement that suited the show's sensibility. This was a show about imperfect people. The slightly imperfect animation felt right. The backgrounds were detailed in specific ways that rewarded careful watching. The Griffin house was consistent across episodes. You could map the floor plan, understand where rooms were in relation to each other, feel the lived-in quality of a space that had been inhabited for years. Stewie's room in particular rewarded repeated viewing. The props in the background that you might miss on a first watch, the evidence of his laboratory activities visible if you looked for it. The Drunken Clam was visually perfect in its specificity. The booths, the neon signs, the particular quality of bar lighting that is warm without being welcoming to anyone who does not already belong there. This is what a bar that Peter and his friends have been going to for years looks like. Not a generic bar, their bar. The town of Quahog had a visual texture that corresponded to its New England setting. The houses were right, the streets were right. The particular quality of suburban Rhode Island geography, slightly dense, slightly old, the kind of place where the infrastructure was built decades ago and has been maintaining itself with varying degrees of success ever since, came through in the way the town was drawn. Animation communicates emotion through means that are different from live action and that operate below conscious awareness more often than above it. The way a character's eyes are drawn, their size, their distance apart, the specific arc of the brow above them determines whether you trust them, whether you find them warm or cold, whether you are on their side before they have done anything. The Family Guy designers made consistent choices in this regard that shaped the audience's relationship to each character in ways the audience was never fully aware of. Peter was drawn to be trusted. His eyes were simple, slightly unfocused, communicating someone whose interior life was not particularly complicated or threatening. He did not look like he was hiding anything, because he wasn't. What you saw was what you got. Lois was drawn with a certain steadiness, eyes that held their ground, a posture that suggested competence without severity. You felt her capability before you heard it. Brian was the most human-looking character in the cast, which was a deliberate choice. His design sat slightly apart from the other characters, with proportions that were closer to actual dog anatomy but not so close as to make him seem like a realistic dog. He was something in between a dog who looked like he could be a person if he chose to be, and mostly chose to be. This visual ambiguity corresponded to his thematic ambiguity, the character who was most fully integrated into human life while technically being the least human member of the household. Section 15: The Music of Family Guy and What It Said. MacFarlane's love of music was one of the most distinctive and most frequently overlooked elements of what he brought to Family Guy. He was not just using songs as background or as comedic punctuation. He was making genuine music, music that had craft and intention behind it, music that drew from a specific lineage of American popular tradition that he knew intimately. The opening theme, with its opening lines about violence in movies and sex on TV, was written in direct homage to the All in the Family theme. The show begins at the piano, exactly as All in the Family did, with two people singing together. It is an explicit signal of where the show was situating itself in the history of the American family sitcom, adjacent to Archie Bunker, operating in the same satirical tradition, but doing it in a time when the tools available for satire were different and the things worth satirizing had changed. MacFarlane was releasing albums of standards during this same period. Big band music, jazz, the classic American popular songbook of the 1940s and 1950s. This was not a nostalgic affectation. It was a genuine love, one that he brought into the show whenever the opportunity arose. The musical numbers in the road to episodes drew directly from this love. They were pastiches of the Bing Crosby and Bob Hope musical tradition, executed with the kind of care that comes from actually knowing what you are pastiching. When Family Guy did a musical number well, it did something that almost no other animated sitcom was capable of doing at the time. It used song to convey emotional content that dialogue could not quite reach. The songs in the best road to episodes said things about the characters, singing them about Brian and Stewie's friendship, about what they meant to each other that no scene of conversation could have said as directly. Music operates on a different register than speech. It can carry feeling that speech can only approximate. There were also the background musical choices, which received less attention but were equally deliberate. The score of the early seasons had a specific quality. It used full orchestration, drawing from the same tradition as the opening theme, avoiding the more synthetic sounds that many animated shows defaulted to in the same period. This gave the show a certain warmth and depth of sound that reinforced the warmth and depth of the show itself. The contrast between the sometimes extreme content and the traditionally warm musical score was part of the show's distinctive tension. When something genuinely dark or transgressive happened on screen, the music underneath it was often not dark or transgressive at all. This was a specific choice. It kept the show from tipping fully into grimness. It maintained the emotional frame that said this was still a family comedy, still a show about people who loved each other, even in its most chaotic moments. Original songs throughout the series were generally of high quality in the early seasons, and they were used sparingly enough that when one appeared, it felt like an event. The songs in the Star Wars parody episodes were affectionate and well executed. The songs in the road to episodes were structurally sound and genuinely singable. The musical numbers that occasionally appeared in regular episodes were handled with the same care. MacFarlane himself was clearly the primary musical voice in these choices, and his taste was specific enough to give the show a consistent musical identity. You knew what a Family Guy song sounded like before the first note was played in the early seasons. It sounded like care, like the work of someone who actually loved music and brought that love to everything it touched. Section 16, Pawtucket and Providence, the New England spirit of the show. Family Guy was always at some level a New England show, and New England is a specific place with a specific spirit, and that spirit informed the show in ways that went beyond the occasional reference to Providence or Pawtucket. New England has a particular relationship with history. It is one of the oldest parts of the country, and it wears that age in specific ways in the density of its towns, in the texture of its architecture, in the way that tradition and modernity sit side by side in a proximity that you do not get in younger parts of the country. Rhode Island specifically is a small, dense state with a character that is genuinely distinctive, not as formally patrician as old Massachusetts, not as rough-hewn as parts of Maine or New Hampshire, but occupying a particular cultural space that MacFarlane knew from first-hand experience. The Griffin family's Irish Catholic identity was specific to a particular strain of New England working-class culture. Irish Catholic New Englanders have a relationship with their identity that is complex and layered. The church, the neighborhood, the social solidarity of people who arrived as immigrants and built a specific kind of community around their shared origins. Peter's automatic religious reflexes, his loyalty to his friends, his working-class pride, all of this was colored by this specific heritage. MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut, just over the Rhode Island border. He studied in Providence. He knew the texture of this region, the particular quality of its neighborhoods, the way that the old industrial character of places like Pawtucket gave a specific flavor to working-class life there that was different from what you would find in the Midwest or the South. Quahog was fictional, but it was fictional in the way that all great fictional small towns are fictional. It was a composite of real places, built from real details, that felt more true than a real place could have been, because it was optimized for truth rather than accuracy. The clam shacks and the sports loyalties and the particular Catholic-inflected guilt and forgiveness cycle of the Griffin family's relationship dynamics, all of it was drawn from somewhere real. The show's relationship to weather was also characteristically New England. Rhode Island has weather that matters: cold winters, the occasional nor'easter, the particular quality of summer that feels like a reward for surviving winter. These things appeared in the show when they were relevant, and they were deployed with the specificity of someone who knew what he was talking about. Section 17. The pilot episode and what it established. The first episode of Family Guy is called Death Has a Shadow. It aired on the 31st of January 1999, after Super Bowl 33. Its writer was Seth MacFarlane himself. Its premise involved Peter getting fired from the happy-go-lucky toy factory after falling asleep on the job following a night of drinking, going on welfare, and receiving an enormous mistaken check that he misuses, leading to an investigation and eventual resolution. This is not the most memorable plot in the show's history. It is not meant to be. Pilot episodes of great shows are rarely the best episodes, they are blueprints. They establish what the show is going to be, who the characters are, what kind of world they inhabit, what the rules are. Death Has a Shadow did all of this with impressive efficiency. In 22 minutes, it established Peter's character, his impulsiveness, his genuine love for his family, his tendency to get himself into situations that then required the rest of the episode to untangle. It established Lois as the patient, capable counterbalance. It established Stewie's evil genius persona. Without explaining it or apologizing for it, he simply was this way, and the show had the confidence to present this as a given. It established Brian's dry wit and his role as the observational voice. It introduced the drunken clam, Peter's friends, the neighborhood. It also introduced the show's willingness to go places. The welfare fraud subplot was not the gentlest entry point. It involved the characters lying to federal authorities, consequences that could theoretically be serious, and a resolution that was both funny and morally ambiguous in a way that most family comedies would have avoided. Stewie's first scene in the pilot has him standing in his high chair, making what sounds to everyone around him like baby noises, but what the audience hears as a formal declaration of intent to rule the world. His mother smiles at him indulgently and hands him a toy. He takes the toy and continues his monologue in his head. This is the Stewie concept in its most essential form, presented without preamble, trusted to land without explanation. MacFarlane's design for the pilot was to establish quickly that this was a specific kind of show, and then let it be that show without excessive justification. He did not need the audience to understand every reference or catch every joke or know all the backstory. He needed them to feel the world as a place worth spending time in, and the pilot accomplished this. The cutaway gag appeared in the very first episode. This is important. The cutaway was not something that developed later as the show evolved. It was there from the beginning, part of the DNA from the pilot. The question that would become the central debate about the show, whether the cutaways enhanced or replaced the storytelling, was present in seed form from the first 22 minutes. In the pilot, the cutaways were brief and specific. They commented on the story rather than interrupting it. They came from character. They were usually triggered by something a character said, and the cutaway extended or illustrated that thing rather than abandoning it. The ratio of story to cutaway in the pilot was close to the ideal. What the pilot did that later seasons would sometimes fail to do was end with the family intact. The crisis was resolved. Peter had made a mess, the show had had its fun with the mess, and now the family was okay. Peter and Lois were okay, the kids were okay, the world of Spooner Street was okay. This resolution was not saccharine or false. The show did not pretend the underlying issues had been addressed, but it was real. The family had come through something together and come out the other side. This was the promise the show made to its audience in the very first episode. We will make a mess. We will have fun with the mess. And at the end, we will put things back together. Because these people matter and they deserve to be put back together. Section 18. The show's relationship with American Catholic identity. Something that is rarely discussed in detail about Family Guy's early seasons is how seriously it took Peter's Irish Catholic identity. This was not a punchline. It was a character element with actual weight. Peter was Irish Catholic in the way that a significant portion of working-class New England was Irish Catholic, not theologically sophisticated, not deeply observant in a doctrinal sense, but bound to the faith through family and community and the specific rhythms of a life organized around parish and holy days and the particular Catholic understanding of guilt and forgiveness. His father, Francis, cold, demanding, difficult to please, embodied a certain strain of Catholic masculinity that was familiar in that community. The man who believed in discipline as an expression of love, who could not quite find the language for warmth but expressed it through expectations and standards and the occasional gruff acknowledgement. Peter spent much of the early seasons trying to earn something from his father that Francis found very difficult to give. The dynamic was specific enough to be recognizable to people who knew that world. The church appeared in the show as a real institution, not simply as a target for jokes about hypocrisy, though it was occasionally that too, but as a place where people in Peter's community actually went and where certain things actually happened that mattered. The tension between Peter's genuine Catholicism and his behavior was a consistent source of comedy, but it was comedy with texture, because the faith was real even when the behavior contradicted it. MacFarlane himself was not religious. He has been openly atheist for many years, and this is reflected in Brian's character and in the show's overall treatment of religious belief. But he was honest enough about the communities he was depicting to let their faith be real within the show, even while he personally did not share it. This is one of the harder things to do in satire, to make the thing you are satirizing into a real thing with real dimensions rather than a straw version of itself. The Catholic guilt cycle, the doing of the thing, the awareness of having done the thing, the confession and absolution. The doing of the thing again was built into Peter's character in ways that the show never named explicitly, but that shaped how his episodes usually unfolded. He did the thing. He felt bad about the thing. He tried to make amends for the thing. He did the next thing. This cycle was both comedic and, in its deepest form, a kind of structural theology. The model of imperfection and forgiveness and imperfection again that Catholic tradition had articulated, and that Peter lived out without knowing he was living out anything in particular. Section 19. What the show said about American masculinity. Family Guy was always, in part, a show about masculinity, about what it meant to be a man of a certain kind at a certain moment in American cultural history, and it had specific, interesting things to say about this. Things that the discourse around the show has mostly either ignored or oversimplified. Peter Griffin represented a particular strand of American masculinity that was, by 1999, already under significant cultural pressure. The working-class dad who was the undisputed head of his household in some formal sense, but who was also obviously not the most capable or competent person in it. This was a figure that television had been dealing with for decades, from Jackie Gleason forward, and the show understood it deeply. What made Peter's masculinity interesting rather than simply conventional was that the show did not pretend the pressure was not there. The tension between the traditional masculine role Peter was supposed to fill, provider, protector, decision-maker, and his actual capabilities, was a constant source of both comedy and something more poignant. He wanted to be the man his family needed him to be. He regularly was not quite that man. He kept trying anyway. Brian's masculinity was a different kind of comedy. Brian was the aspirational, masculine, ideal intellectual, cultured, urbane, emotionally articulate. He was what the culture of the late 1990s was beginning to celebrate as the new male. Sensitive, literate, politically aware, not hiding behind conventional masculine postures. And the show gently, consistently, and very funnily made the case that this aspiration had its own failure modes. That being sensitive and literate could become its own kind of performance. That emotional articulateness could curdle into manipulation. That the progressive pose could become a way of feeling superior to people who were, in some important respects, more genuinely decent than you. This was not a reactionary argument. It was a more honest argument. Brian was not criticized for being progressive or cultured. He was criticized for being dishonest about those things, for using them as a way of presenting an image rather than living a reality. The show's critique of Brian was always about authenticity, not about his values themselves. Quagmire represented another masculine archetype, the arrested adolescent, the man who had avoided the domestic commitments that organized Peter's life and Brian's anxieties by simply declining to make them. His serial womanizing was played largely for comedy, but in the early seasons the show was careful not to let him be simply a comic villain. He had genuine warmth. He was a good friend. He was loyal in the bar booth in ways that mattered. His life was a different kind of life, not a lesser one. Joe Swanson was perhaps the most interesting masculine figure in the show's supporting cast. He was the one who had been tested, who had been injured in the line of duty, and had lost physical capabilities that defined a certain version of masculinity, and who had come out the other side of that test as himself. Not diminished, not compensating. Still the person he had been, living in a different body and managing that difference with a directness that the show treated as admirable. Peter's relationship with Joe, initially one of jealousy, evolving into genuine friendship, traced a specific growth arc for Peter's character. He started out threatened by Joe's physical competence and the neighborhood's admiration of it. He ended up sitting in a bar booth with a man he genuinely respected, having made peace with the fact that someone else could be impressive without that diminishing him. This is not a complex psychological journey, but it is a real one, and the show let Peter take it without making it into a lecture about what masculinity should be. Section 20. The neighborhood as a character. Let us spend some time with the world that surrounded the house on Spooner Street, because that world was as carefully built as any of its residents. Spooner Street itself had a particular quality that the show established through consistent visual and narrative repetition. It was a street of comfortable but not wealthy houses, close together, with lawns that were maintained at various levels of care, with neighbors who knew each other with varying degrees of fondness. This was not a street where people did not know their neighbors. It was a street where knowing your neighbors was simply part of the deal, unavoidable and occasionally burdensome, and also, in specific ways, a source of genuine community. The relationships between the houses, between the Griffins, the Swansons, the Browns were drawn with the texture of real neighborhood life. There was the awareness of what was happening in each other's houses that comes from proximity. There was the assumption that you would be there when needed. There was the occasional intrusion into each other's lives that was sometimes welcome and sometimes not. Peter's backyard was another recurring setting. The grill, the lawn chair, the particular quality of a backyard that was used for genuine relaxation as much as for anything else. Peter grilling was Peter at his most content, surrounded by cold beer and something cooking, in a space that was his in a simple and complete way. This was domestic comfort without pretension. The Drunken Clam occupied a central position in the show's geography. A bar that real regulars go to is not simply a place to drink. It is a social institution. It is the place where the unstructured time of life gets organized into something with shape and meaning. The booth in the back where Peter and his friends sat was the place where their lives were reviewed, problems were considered, plans were formed or abandoned, and the general texture of being alive in their specific situation was processed in the company of people who shared it. The bar's owner, a figure who appeared occasionally in the early seasons, maintained the specific quality of a barman who has been doing this long enough to understand the role without needing to talk about it. He kept the drinks coming. He was present but not intrusive. He created the conditions under which the conversations could happen. The church, St. Cecilia's, where the Griffin family attended, appeared infrequently but with consistency. It was drawn with the specific quality of a working-class Catholic parish church. Not grand, not particularly beautiful, but solid. The interior had the feel of a place that had been in continuous use for a long time, that had been present for a community's baptisms and weddings and funerals, that had absorbed a great deal of human experience into its walls. James Woods Regional High School was one of the show's running jokes about celebrity, but it also served a genuine function as the setting for Meg and Chris's social lives. The school was drawn as a recognizable type. The regional high school that served a mixed population, not affluent, not uniformly anything, just the particular institution that happened to serve the town that the Griffins happened to live in. The Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter eventually worked, was one of the show's most carefully realized institutional settings. A brewery has a specific quality, the smell, the machinery, the particular hierarchy of a working environment built around a physical product, and the show captured this without overdoing it. Peter's job there was something he was actually present in, something he cared about in his own way, not just a plot device to get him out of the house during work hours. All of these places together created the sense of a real world. A world where people had places they went, where the geography of daily life had meaning, where space was organized around the rhythms of the lives that happened inside it. This is what setting does when it is done well. It makes the story feel grounded in something that exists before the episode starts and will continue after it ends. Section 21. The show's relationship with television history. Family Guy was in constant conversation with the history of American television in a way that was more than simply referential. It was participating in a tradition, It knew where it came from, and it said so, openly and with affection. The opening theme was the clearest expression of this. Two people at a piano, singing about family and the state of the culture. This was directly from All in the Family. MacFarlane has spoken about All in the Family as one of his primary influences, and the structural DNA of the Griffin family clearly descended from the Bunker family, the working-class patriarch who was impossible and also human, the more competent wife who managed him, the household, as a microcosm of American cultural tensions. But the conversation did not stop at All in the Family. The show was also in dialogue with The Simpsons, as everyone noted, though the relationship was more complex than simple imitation. Family Guy was doing something different from The Simpsons, even when the surface similarities were most pronounced. The Simpsons was built on coherent characterization and earned emotional development over long arcs. Family Guy was built on speed, on variety, on the willingness to abandon consistency for the sake of a better joke. These were different aesthetics, not inferior and superior versions of the same aesthetic. The show also had a specific relationship with the Hollywood musical tradition that went beyond the Road to episodes. MacFarlane was steeped in the movies and television shows of the 1950s and 1960s, and this showed in the show's sensibility in its pacing, in its musical choices, in the specific references that showed up in the cutaways. The golden age of Hollywood was always present in Family Guy as a reference point, a kind of standard against which the current cultural moment was implicitly being measured. The show's pilot had a specific formal quality that connected it to earlier television. The structure, the domestic problem, the escalating complications, the resolution at the kitchen table was the structure of classic American family sitcoms. Family Guy used this structure and then systematically violated it, introducing elements that no classic sitcom would have permitted, but it always started from the classic template. The violation was meaningful only because the original was known. This relationship with television history gave the show a rootedness that purely transgressive content would not have provided. It was not simply tearing things down. It was building on a foundation while doing something new with the materials. Section 22 Letters from the Living Room. Why this show felt personal. There is a quality in the best Family Guy episodes, particularly the best of the first 3 seasons, that is hard to describe precisely, but that most people who watch the show during that period will recognize. It is the quality of something personal, of a show that feels like it was made by someone who had thought about these specific things and had something specific to say about them. This quality is rare. Most television, even good television, does not have it. Most television is competent, it does what it is supposed to do, it executes its format with skill, it delivers what the genre promises. Good television does all of this and also has a certain aesthetic consistency, a recognizable voice, a commitment to quality that elevates it above competence. But the personal quality, the quality of something made by a specific person with specific ideas who actually cared whether those ideas were communicated, is something else again. It is the quality that makes you feel, watching it, that you are being talked to rather than broadcast at. MacFarlane's involvement in the early seasons had this quality. The show was his in a way that later seasons, when he stepped back from day-to-day creative involvement, were not. The specific mix of high and low culture, the specific political sensibility, the specific emotional register, the balance between sentiment and cynicism, between warmth and transgression, these were his choices, made by someone who had thought carefully about what he was trying to create. When you watch the first episode and then the 20th episode and they feel like they were made by the same person with the same vision, that consistency is the result of someone being in charge of something they cared about. It is the result of Seth MacFarlane being in every room of this show, looking at everything, shaping it toward his particular sense of what it should be. The show felt personal because it was the working-class New England world it depicted was a world MacFarlane knew. The specific mix of pop culture references it made were the references of someone with a specific cultural biography, someone who had grown up watching particular things and listening to particular music and had been formed by particular experiences. The politics were genuine. The love of classic Hollywood was genuine. The care about the family at the center of everything was genuine. This is what you lose when a creator steps away from their creation. Not the craft, the new people can be just as technically skilled. Not even the quality sometimes. The new people are more disciplined, more consistent, more careful in certain ways. What you lose is the specific personal quality that makes a show feel like it came from somewhere real, like it was saying something particular rather than executing a format. For 3 seasons, Family Guy had that quality in abundance. It felt like a letter from someone who had things on their mind and had found a very funny, very strange, very specific way to say them. Section 23, Rest Now. The Quiet Ending. We have been walking through this world for a long time now, and there is something appropriate about the slowness of that walk. Because what Family Guy was at its best, at its most honest, at its most fully itself, was not something you could understand by rushing through it. The jokes were loud, the characters were big, the cutaways were sudden and disorienting, and sometimes brilliant, and sometimes less so. The surface of the show was relentlessly eventful, relentlessly noisy, relentlessly demanding of your attention. But underneath all of that noise, there was something quiet, something worth sitting with. It was the sound of a family going about their life in a yellow house on Spooner Street in a fictional town in Rhode Island. Breakfast in the morning, Peter leaving for work, the kids going to school, Lois at the piano teaching someone's child a scale, the drunken clam in the evening, Peter and his friends in their booth, the familiar conversation about nothing important that has been happening in this booth for years. Stewie in his room, Rupert tucked under one arm, cataloging the day's failures and planning tomorrow's attempt. Brian on the couch with a book he may or may not be reading, thinking about the novel he will probably never quite finish. This is the show underneath the show that was always there if you looked for it, the show that millions of people loved without necessarily knowing exactly what they were loving, the feeling of a family that kept coming home to each other, kept trying to be better to each other, kept failing and trying again. That cycle, the failing and the trying, was never going to be a perfect story. It was never going to resolve cleanly. Families do not resolve cleanly. They just continue. They accumulate years and arguments and reconciliations and the particular joy of specific moments that somehow stay with you. They are ongoing. The Griffins were ongoing. They were always going to be ongoing. And the best version of the show understood this and found in it something to celebrate, not the resolution, but the continuation. Not the arrival somewhere better, but the willingness to keep going anyway. Let that be the last thing we say tonight. Not about the show, exactly. About what it was for. What the best of it was reaching toward. A family that loved each other imperfectly and kept showing up. A house that was messy and loud and always had something going wrong in it. A neighborhood where people knew each other and helped each other and occasionally drove each other crazy, as neighbors do. A story about how that is enough. Not perfect, not what you planned, but enough. Rest well. The Griffins will be there when you come back. If this kind of slow, detailed, immersive storytelling is the thing you want more of, please subscribe. It is completely free and it is genuinely the most useful thing you can do to keep this content coming. And drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is wherever you are. Something about knowing that people are listening from all different places, at all different hours, carries its own particular warmth. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves. End of script total. 30,000 plus words. Fall asleep to what Family Guy was actually about. Supplemental section. The characters in context. A deeper reading. There are dimensions of the Griffin family that we have touched but not fully explored, and since we have the time and the inclination, let us go deeper. Peter Griffin's full name, Justin Peter Lowenbro Griffin Sr., contains more information about him than most people notice. The Lowenbro is a beer brand. His middle name is literally a beer. This was placed in the show without fanfare, without the writers pausing to draw attention to it, because it was the kind of detail that was right without needing explanation. Peter's relationship with beer was not a character flaw in the traditional sense. It was a character expression. It was the way he participated in the social rituals of his world, the way he relaxed, the way he marked the transition from the working day to the evening. The happy-go-lucky toy factory, where Peter worked in the first season, deserves more attention than it usually gets. The name alone is doing work. There is something genuinely sad about a man named Peter working at a place called the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, as if the universe had decided to surround him with the external trappings of cheerfulness, while his actual life was as complicated and imperfect as anyone else's. The toy factory was not shown in great detail, but what was shown was the texture of assembly line work, the specific kind of labor that requires physical presence but not constant intellectual engagement, the kind where your hands are doing their thing while your mind is available for other uses. Peter spent those hours at the factory inside his own head to a degree that the work itself permitted. This is its own kind of freedom, and it is a freedom that certain kinds of work offer that other, more demanding work does not. When Peter lost the toy factory job and eventually found his way to the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, the change was significant. A brewery is a different kind of place. There is craftsmanship in it, or at least the idea of craftsmanship, even in large commercial operations. Beer is a product with a history and a culture and a set of associations that are different from plastic toys. Peter's relationship with his workplace became, at the brewery, slightly more legible as a relationship between a man and his professional identity. The Pawtucket Patriot Ale itself, the show's fictional beer brand, became a recurring element in the fabric of the show in ways that were quietly funny. The locals drank it. The brewery was a source of civic pride in Quahog, in the way that regional products can be in American small cities. The thing that says we make something here, this place produces something. We have an identity beyond being the place where people happen to live. Lois's piano teaching was similarly specific and similarly doing quiet work throughout the early seasons. She charged per lesson. She had students who came to the house. The piano was in the living room, visible in the background of many scenes, present even when it was not being played. This instrument was a link between the life she had chosen and the person she had been before that choice. The girl from a wealthy family who had been educated in the arts, who had kept music as one of the things she could call her own. Music was how Lois maintained continuity with herself. Even in the chaos of the Griffin household, even with Peter's schemes and Stewie's schemes and Meg's social crises and Chris's general bewilderment, there was the piano. Something she was genuinely good at. Something that was just hers. Brian's alcoholism was presented in the early seasons as a character detail rather than a storyline. He drank martinis in the evenings. He occasionally drank too much and did things he would not have done sober. The show neither moralized about this nor treated it as inconsequential. It was simply part of who Brian was, one of the ways he managed the specific quality of his life, the slight displacement, the gap between his ambitions and his reality. The martini itself was a carefully chosen prop. A martini is not just a drink. It is a statement about the kind of person you consider yourself to be. It is a drink with a history and a literature and a set of associations, Humphrey Bogart, Frank Sinatra, the Rat Pack era that McFarlane clearly loved. Brian drinking martinis was Brian aligning himself with a particular tradition of sophisticated masculinity, placing himself in that lineage, claiming it as his own. That the dog in the working-class household in Pawtucket was drinking gin martinis while Peter drank Pawtucket Patriot Ale was one of the show's most economical character contrasts. Stewie's teddy bear Rupert was one of the show's most quietly devastating elements. Here was this creature of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary ambition who was also, in the way that mattered most to him, just a small child who needed his bear. The bear went everywhere with him. The bear was present in his crib, in his laboratory, on his adventures. The bear was the single point of absolute vulnerability in a personality that had armored itself against everything else. When Rupert was threatened, when something happened to the bear, when Stewie lost it, when it was damaged, the response was out of all proportion to the stimulus, and the show understood that this disproportionality was the truth of the character. Stewie was not overreacting to a toy being lost. He was reacting to the only thing in his life that was purely comfort, purely warmth, purely his being threatened. The bear was the place where the evil genius baby was just a baby. This is the kind of character detail that becomes a shorthand for something larger. When you saw Rupert in a scene, you knew something about where Stewie actually was emotionally, even if the dialogue was about something else entirely. It was a visual cue, a piece of character code, that the show deployed consistently and that paid dividends every time. Chris Griffin's artistic talent was handled with more subtlety than is usually credited. The show never made a big deal of it. It did not build entire episodes around it. It surfaced occasionally, was acknowledged as real, and then receded into the background while the episode continued. This was the right choice. Chris was not a character defined by his talent. He was a character defined by his warmth and his bewilderment, and the talent was one fact among many, present without dominating. The episode in the first season where a visiting art critic noticed Chris's work was the most direct engagement with this element, and the show handled it carefully, acknowledging the talent as genuine without suggesting it would automatically translate into any particular future. Talented teenagers are not automatically successful adults. The talent is real, but the path from the talent to the life is not guaranteed. The show understood this and did not pretend otherwise. Meg's friends, or rather her persistent, mostly unsuccessful attempts to have friends, were a recurring element of her characterization in the early seasons. She wanted badly to be part of a group, to have people who would choose to spend time with her, to have the social experience that she watched other teenagers having, and that seemed always slightly out of reach for her. The show never gave her this cleanly, and this was correct. If Meg had simply found her people and been happy, the character would have lost the quality that made her interesting. Her longing was her most human quality. Her continued searching, despite the repeated evidence that the searching was not going well, was a kind of courage that the show recognized even when it did not always honor. What the early show consistently did, even in its darkest moments regarding Meg, was maintain the basic position that her desire to be loved and seen was legitimate. It was not a character flaw to want what she wanted. The failing was in the world around her, including her own family for not providing it, not in Meg for continuing to want it. Supplemental section. The philosophy of the cutaway in its best form. We have talked about the cutaway gag as a structural element, but let us spend a moment with what the very best cutaways were actually doing, because the best ones were doing something more interesting than just being funny. The cutaway gag, in its ideal form, was a form of indirect characterization. By choosing to cut away to a specific reference at a specific moment, the show was saying something about the character who triggered the cutaway. The choice of what Peter's remark reminded him of, the choice of what Brian's observation led to these choices, communicated personality even when the character was not in the frame. When Peter compared a situation to something from his past, from a specific era of popular culture, from a specific kind of entertainment, the comparison revealed what his mind ran to under pressure. His interior was organized around the television shows and movies and songs of his particular generation, and the cutaways were a way of showing what that interior actually looked like. The best cutaways also had an element of surprise that was specific rather than random. The joke worked because the connection between the setup and the cutaway was unexpected, but once you saw it, felt right. The unexpectedness was the laugh. The rightness was what made the laugh last. There is a difference between a cutaway that surprises you and a cutaway that surprises you and then, a second later, makes a kind of sense. The first kind gets a reaction. The second kind stays with you. The early Family Guy writers were aiming for the second kind, and in the best episodes, they hit it consistently. The cutaway was also a way of compressing time and information. In 22 minutes, a show can only cover so much ground. The cutaway allowed the writers to suggest a vast quantity of backstory, of character history, of cultural reference, that would have taken much longer to establish through conventional narration. A 15-second cutaway could establish something about who Peter was at a particular moment in his past, adding depth to his current situation without derailing the episode to explain it. This compression function was what made the cutaway genuinely useful as a storytelling tool in the early seasons, rather than simply an interruption. It was doing work that needed doing, in less time than any other available method. The failure mode of the cutaway, the version that the later seasons fell into more and more, was when the cutaway stopped doing this work and started existing for its own sake. When the connection between the setup and the cutaway became genuinely arbitrary. When the cutaway did not comment on the character or the situation but simply replaced them, the tool had stopped working as a tool. It had become filler. Understanding the difference between the productive cutaway and the filler cutaway is understanding the central technical distinction between the early show and the later show. It is not about taste or standards in some abstract sense. It is about a specific craft element being used well versus being misused. Supplemental section friendship as the show's second subject. If family was the first subject of Family Guy, the explicit subject, the one stated in the title, the one organized by the premise, then friendship was its second subject, running parallel through all the same seasons and deserving the same kind of attention. The friendship between Peter and his three neighbors, Joe, Cleveland, Quagmire was organized around the drunken clam in the way that real friendships are often organized around a specific place that becomes theirs. The bar was not incidental. It was the institution within which the friendship was maintained and expressed. American men of Peter's generation and class background often had this kind of friendship, the friendship that lives in a specific place and a specific ritual, that does not require much explicit conversation about the friendship itself, that is expressed through showing up and being present rather than through declaration. You demonstrate that someone is your friend by being at the bar when they are there, by sitting in the same booth, by making the same jokes you have made 100 times and laughing at them anyway. This kind of friendship is frequently misunderstood as shallow. It is not shallow. It is organized differently from friendships that are more explicitly verbal and emotionally expressive, but the emotional content is real. The loyalty is real. The support is real. It is just expressed through different signals, signals that the show understood and depicted accurately. When Joe was in difficulty when something was wrong at home, when his disability created specific challenges, when the gap between who he had been and who he was now felt particularly acute, Peter showed up. Not with articulate emotional support, with presence. With the offer of another round and the implicit message that nothing needed to be said, nothing needed to be explained, they would just sit here together for a while, and that was enough. This is something that television rarely gets right, and Family Guy in its early seasons got it right. The friendship of men who do not say very much to each other about the things that matter most, but who are present in exactly the way that matters most, was depicted with accuracy and without condescension. Brian's friendship with Peter was different in kind, but equally real. They talked more than Peter talked to his other friends. They disagreed more than Peter disagreed with his other friends. The relationship had the texture of a friendship where the participants were genuinely different from each other and knew it, and had decided that the difference was interesting rather than problematic. Brian was better able to see Peter clearly than Peter's human friends were, because his intelligence was different from theirs, because his perspective was different, because being a dog in a human family gave him a particular vantage point that was not available to anyone inside the standard categories. He could see Peter's goodness and Peter's failure simultaneously, without the loyalty blinding him to one or the frustration blinding him to the other. Peter valued this. Not consciously, probably not in the way you value something when you can name what it is doing for you, but in the way you value something when its absence would be felt immediately and its presence is assumed without examination. Brian was present. That was the valuable thing. That his presence included honest assessment rather than reflexive agreement was part of what made it worth having. Stewie and Brian's friendship was the show's third version of this, and in some ways the most interesting, because it was the most openly stated. They said things to each other that the other pairs of friends did not say. Their friendship was more verbal, more explicit about its own emotional content than either Peter's bar friendships or the Peter-Brian dynamic. Part of this was Stewie's character, a person who had extremely precise language for everything he thought and felt, who was not socialized into the kind of masculine reticence about emotional expression that affected the human male characters. His sophistication was verbal, and verbal sophistication includes the vocabulary to name things that other people sense but cannot articulate. He said things to Brian like, "I would not know what to do without you," directly, without performative embarrassment. He meant it, and he said it, because he had the language for it and because he understood that saying the thing was sometimes the right way to honor the thing. This gave the Stewie-Brian friendship a different quality from the others, more explicitly tender, more willing to live in its own emotional content, more comfortable with the statement of what it was. And this made it one of the most beloved elements of the show across many seasons, continuing to work even as other relationships faltered. End of full script. Fall asleep to what Family Guy was actually about. A final word before sleep. There is one last thing worth saying. Something that ties the whole of what we have explored together into something you can carry with you. Family Guy, in its truest form, was about the space between who we are and who we wish we were. Every single character in that house on Spooner Street lived in that space. Peter wished he were a better father. Lois wished her family needed her less and also more. Brian wished he were the writer he told himself he was. Stewie wished he were free of the physical constraints of being 12 months old. Meg wished someone would look at her the way she looked at the world. Chris wished he understood things a little more clearly. None of them got what they wished for cleanly or completely. Life does not work that way. But all of them kept trying, kept showing up to the same kitchen table, the same living room, the same bar, the same high school corridors, and trying again. That is what love looks like when it is not performing itself. When it has given up on looking graceful and is just doing the work. When the people who are supposed to be together are still together. Not because everything is perfect, but because the alternative, the life without this specific house, and these specific difficult people, is less imaginable than whatever difficulty today brings. That is the show. Underneath all of it, that is what it was always about. Sleep well. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and if you enjoyed this journey, subscribing is the one thing that makes sure we can take the next one together. Good night.